The flashing red and blue lights cut through the evening darkness like knives. Attorney Jerome Washington pulled his Mercedes-Benz to the curb, his hands already moving to the 10-2 position on the steering wheel. At 45 years old, he'd learned long ago that survival meant following a precise protocol during police encounters. The digital clock on his dashboard read 8:47 p.m. Jerome had been driving home from the annual State Bar Association dinner, where he delivered the keynote address as the newly elected president. His tuxedo jacket hung neatly in the back seat, his bow tie loosened after 3 hours of networking and speeches about justice and legal reform. Officer Bradley Stevens approached the driver's side window with deliberate slowness. At 32 years old, Stevens carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never questioned his authority. His partner, Officer Kyle Morrison, positioned himself at the passenger side, hand resting casually on his service weapon. Stevens tapped the window with his knuckles. The sound echoed in the quiet residential neighborhood like gunshots. Jerome lowered the window exactly halfway, keeping his movements visible and deliberate. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I was stopped?" Stevens leaned down, his face filling the window frame. His breath carried the scent of coffee and something else Jerome couldn't identify. "License and registration, now." "Certainly. I'm going to reach into my jacket pocket for my wallet. My registration is in the glove compartment." "I didn't ask for a narrative, just produce the documents." Jerome retrieved his wallet with careful precision, extracting his driver's license. The leather wallet was expensive, a gift from his law firm partners when he made senior partner 5 years earlier. His fingers moved to the glove compartment, retrieving the vehicle registration. Stevens examined the license with exaggerated scrutiny, holding it up to his flashlight beam. "Jerome Washington, this address current?" "Yes, sir, officer. May I ask the reason for the stop?" "You were speeding. Posted limit is 25. Radar clocked you at 31. Jerome's legal mind immediately processed the information. 6 miles over the speed limit in a residential area. A warning level infraction at most. But he'd learned that challenging police officers during stops rarely ended well for people who looked like him. Morrison circled around to Stevens' position, studying Jerome through the window. His gaze took in the expensive suit, the luxury vehicle, the calm demeanor. Something about the scene didn't fit his expectations. "What do you do for work?" Morrison demanded. Jerome hesitated slightly. Experience had taught him that claiming to be an attorney often escalated police encounters. Officers became defensive, assuming he would challenge their authority or threaten legal action. "I work in the legal field." Stevens' eyes narrowed. "Legal field? What's that supposed to mean? You a paralegal? Court clerk?" "I'm an attorney." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Both officers exchanged glances that Jerome recognized immediately. Disbelief mixed with hostility. "Attorney?" Stevens repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "What kind of attorney drives around at night in a Mercedes worth more than my annual salary?" "I practice corporate law. Officer, I believe this is a routine traffic stop for a minor speed violation." Morrison's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Corporate law, right. Where'd you get your degree? Online university?" Jerome's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Harvard Law School, class of 2005. The officer's disbelief deepened visibly. Stevens studied the driver's license again as if it might reveal something he'd missed initially. "Harvard Law," Stevens muttered. "And I suppose you're a partner at some big downtown firm?" "Senior partner at Blackstone, Crawford & Associates." Morrison pulled out his phone, beginning to record. The red recording light blinked steadily in the darkness. "You know what I think? I think we've got ourselves a fake lawyer here. Probably some drug dealer with a stolen car and fake documents." Jerome's professional composure remained intact, but his pulse quickened. He recognized the dangerous shift in the encounter's tone. What had begun as a routine traffic stop was evolving into something more sinister. "Officers, I understand your skepticism, but I assure you my credentials are legitimate. If you'd like to verify my bar admission, the State Bar website has a public attorney database." Stevens leaned closer to the window, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Here's what I think happened. You stole this car, printed some fake documents, and now you're trying to talk your way out of trouble by pretending to be something you're not. Sir, that's completely inaccurate. I can provide additional identification if needed. Morrison had walked back to the patrol car, speaking into his radio. Jerome could hear fragments of the conversation. Suspicious subject claiming to be attorney. Expensive vehicle. Possible stolen property. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Jerome's 20 years of legal experience had taught him to recognize when encounters were spiraling beyond reason. But his experience as a black man in America had taught him something more important: how to survive.
Officer Stevens, I'm going to remain calm and cooperative. I understand you're doing your job. However, I believe there may be some confusion about my identity and profession. Stevens straightened up, his hand moving to his radio. Dispatch, we're going to need backup at this location. We've got a subject making false claims about his identity. Possible fraud situation.
Jerome's heart rate increased, but his expression remained neutral. The request for backup transformed a simple traffic stop into a potential arrest scenario. He began mentally calculating his options, all of them limited and dangerous. Morrison returned from the patrol car carrying what appeared to be a tablet device. I ran the plates. Vehicle is registered to a Jerome Washington at the address on the license. Could be identity theft, Stevens replied without missing a beat. Probably stole the identity along with the car. The circular logic was maddening, but Jerome recognized the pattern. When officers predetermined guilt, evidence supporting innocence became evidence of more sophisticated criminal behavior. Officers, I'm willing to submit to any reasonable verification process. You can contact my law firm, check the Bar Association records, or verify my identity through any official channels. Stevens' radio crackled with an incoming transmission. Unit 47, backup is en route. ETA 3 minutes. Jerome calculated quickly. Once backup arrived, the situation would become exponentially more complicated. Multiple officers meant multiple perspectives, all reinforcing each other's assumptions. The encounter would likely end with his arrest on fabricated charges. He made a decision that would change everything. Officers, before your backup arrives, I'd like to make a phone call. I have the right to contact my attorney. Morrison laughed harshly. Your attorney? You claim to be an attorney. I'd like to contact a colleague who can verify my identity and credentials. Stevens shook his head dismissively. You don't get to make phone calls during a traffic stop. That's not how this works. Jerome's legal mind processed the constitutional implications, but he remained focused on immediate survival. Officer, I'm not resisting or being uncooperative. I'm simply asking for a reasonable accommodation to resolve this confusion. The only confusion here is you thinking we're stupid enough to believe your story. Blue and red lights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as backup units approached. Jerome's window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Officers, I understand your position. However, I need you to understand mine. I'm being accused of crimes I didn't commit based solely on your disbelief that a black man can be a successful attorney. Stevens' face flushed with anger. Don't you dare play the race card with me. This has nothing to do with race. Then what evidence do you have that I've committed any crime beyond driving 6 miles over the speed limit? The question hung in the air unanswered as the first backup unit arrived. Officer Richard Hayes emerged from the patrol car, surveying the scene with practiced efficiency. At 38 years old, Hayes had 15 years of experience and a reputation for thorough investigations. What do we have? Hayes asked, approaching Stevens. Subject claiming to be a lawyer, driving an expensive vehicle, carrying what appears to be fraudulent identification, possible stolen property and identity theft. Hayes studied Jerome through the window, taking in his appearance and demeanor. Something about the situation felt off, but he couldn't immediately identify what bothered him. Has he been combative or threatening? Negative. But he's sticking to his story about being some big-shot attorney from Harvard. Hayes nodded slowly, His experience had taught him that most criminals weren't sophisticated enough to maintain complex deceptions under pressure. Yet this subject remained remarkably composed and articulate. Jerome recognized the arrival of a potentially more reasonable officer. "Officer Hayes, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'm willing to cooperate fully to resolve this confusion about my identity." Hayes approached the window, studying Jerome's face carefully. "What's your name and occupation?" "Jerome Washington. I'm an attorney and the current president of the State Bar Association." The claim was so audacious that Hayes paused momentarily. Either this was an elaborate deception by a sophisticated criminal, or they were making a catastrophic mistake. Stevens interceded quickly. "He's been making increasingly grandiose claims. First, he was just an attorney, then a partner. Now he's claiming to be president of the Bar Association." Hayes pulled Stevens aside for a whispered conference. Jerome could see them gesturing toward him while speaking in urgent tones. Morrison continued recording, his phone capturing every moment of the encounter. The second backup unit arrived, bringing Officer Detective Lisa Parker. Her reputation for thorough investigations preceded her, and Jerome felt a slight surge of hope. Detective Parker had built her career on facts rather than assumptions. Parker surveyed the scene before approaching Jerome's vehicle. Her experience had taught her to question initial narratives, especially in situations that seemed unusually complex. "Mr. Washington, I'm Detective Parker. Can you explain why you're out driving at this hour?" Jerome appreciated the professional tone and direct question. "I was returning home from the annual State Bar Association dinner. I delivered the keynote address as the newly elected president." Parker's eyebrows raised slightly. The claim was specific and easily verifiable. "Where was this dinner held?" "The Grand Continental Hotel downtown. The event concluded approximately an hour ago." Hayes rejoined the group, having concluded his whispered conference with Stevens. "Detective Officers Stevens and Morrison believe we're dealing with a sophisticated fraud case. Subject is making claims about his identity that seem unlikely given—" He paused, recognizing that completing the sentence would reveal the racial assumptions underlying their suspicions. Detective Parker understood the unspoken implication immediately. She'd seen similar situations before, where officers' preconceptions about race and success created unnecessary confrontations. "Has anyone actually attempted to verify his claims?" Stevens looked uncomfortable. "We don't have time to investigate every story criminals tell us. What evidence suggests he's a criminal?" The question exposed the fundamental weakness in their approach. Beyond driving slightly over the speed limit, Jerome had committed no observable violations. Their entire case rested on disbelief that he could legitimately be who he claimed to be. Morrison held up his phone, still recording. "He's been making increasingly elaborate claims about his profession. Classic behavior of someone trying to talk their way out of trouble." Detective Parker studied Jerome's appearance and demeanor more carefully. His clothing was expensive and well-tailored. His vocabulary and speech patterns suggested significant education. His composure under pressure indicated someone accustomed to high-stress professional situations. "Mr. Washington, do you have any additional identification or documentation that might help verify your profession?" Jerome reached slowly into his jacket pocket, retrieving a business card holder. He selected a card and handed it through the window. Detective Parker examined the card under her flashlight. The paper quality was expensive, the printing professional. Blackstone, Crawford and Associates, Senior Partner, Jerome Washington, J.D. She turned the card over, noting the law firm's address and contact information. Everything appeared legitimate and professionally produced. "This could be fake," Stevens interjected quickly. "Anyone can print fake business cards." "That's true," Parker acknowledged. "Mr. Washington, is there someone at your firm who could verify your identity at this hour?" Jerome considered the question carefully. His law partners would certainly vouch for him, but calling them at nearly 9 p.m. would require explaining the humiliating circumstances of the traffic stop. "Detective, I believe the simplest verification would be checking the State Bar Association website. My name, photograph, and biographical information are publicly available in their member directory." Parker nodded thoughtfully. The suggestion demonstrated confidence in his claims and provided an immediate verification method. Stevens sensed control of the situation slipping away. "Detective, we can't spend all night investigating every story. We have probable cause for arrest based on suspicious circumstances." What suspicious circumstances specifically? The question forced Stevens to articulate assumptions he'd preferred to keep implicit. The combination of expensive vehicle, claims of professional success, and he stopped, realizing that completing the sentence would expose the racial profiling underlying his suspicions. Detective Parker understood perfectly. 20 years of police work had shown her countless examples of officers who couldn't accept that Black Americans could achieve significant professional success. The radio crackled with another incoming transmission. "All units, we have reports of a robbery in progress 3 blocks from your current location. Units 23 and 45 respond immediately." Hayes and Morrison looked toward their patrol cars, torn between the developing situation and the active crime call. Jerome recognized the moment as potentially decisive. "Detective Parker, I understand you have more pressing matters to attend to. I'm willing to follow you to the police station for proper identification verification if that would resolve this situation." The offer surprised everyone. Most people in Jerome's position would demand to be released immediately. His willingness to cooperate further suggested genuine confidence in his identity claims. Stevens shook his head vigorously. "We're not letting him drive anywhere. If he's operating a stolen vehicle, we can't allow him to continue. Then I'll surrender my keys voluntarily and ride in your patrol car," Jerome offered. "I have nothing to hide and want to resolve this confusion as quickly as possible." Detective Parker studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception or desperation. Instead, she saw calm confidence and genuine willingness to cooperate. The robbery call came through the radio again, more urgent this time. Hayes looked conflicted between his duty to respond to active crimes and his involvement in the developing situation. "Detective, I think we need to make a decision quickly," Hayes said. "Either we have enough evidence to arrest him or we need to resolve this and respond to the robbery call." Parker nodded, reaching for her own phone. "Mr. Washington, I'm going to verify your Bar Association membership right now. If your claims are accurate, you'll be free to go with an apology. If they're false, you'll be arrested for fraud and false identification." Jerome felt a wave of relief mixed with vindication. Finally, someone was willing to check facts rather than rely on assumptions. Detective Parker's fingers moved quickly across her smartphone screen, navigating to the State Bar Association website. The page loaded slowly in the evening darkness, each second stretching into eternity. Stevens watched nervously, his career potentially hanging in the balance. If Jerome's claims proved accurate, the racial profiling implications would be undeniable and professionally catastrophic. The website finally loaded completely, revealing a search function for attorney verification. Parker typed Jerome Washington into the search field and pressed enter. The results would change everything. Detective Parker's phone screen illuminated the faces of everyone gathered around Jerome's Mercedes. The State Bar Association website had loaded completely, displaying search results that would shatter assumptions and careers. Jerome Washington, attorney license number 45782, active status, Parker read aloud. Her voice carried a mix of relief and growing concern about the situation's implications. Stevens moved closer to see the screen, his confidence evaporating with each word. "That could be fake too. Anyone can create a website." Parker's expression hardened. "Officer Stevens, this is the official State Bar Association website, the same database law enforcement uses for attorney verification." She continued reading from Jerome's profile. Harvard Law School, JD 2005, senior partner at Blackstone Crawford & Associates, current president of the State Bar Association, elected March 15th of this year. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the radio chatter seemed to fade as the implications sank in for everyone present. Jerome remained motionless in his driver's seat, watching the officers' faces process the reality they'd refused to accept. 20 years of legal practice had taught him that vindication often came with its own complications. Morrison lowered his phone, the recording light still blinking. What had begun as evidence of a criminal encounter had become documentation of something far more problematic for the officers involved. Hayes stepped back from the group, his 15 years of experience telling him they were approaching a career-defining moment. "Detective, I think we need to handle this very carefully." "Mr. Washington," Parker addressed Jerome directly, her tone noticeably more respectful, "I apologize for the confusion. You're obviously free to go." Stevens's face had gone pale in the streetlight. His mind raced through the implications of what had just occurred. The president of the State Bar Association had been subjected to what could only be described as racial profiling. "Sir, there was clearly some miscommunication here," Stevens said, his voice lacking its earlier authority. "We were just doing our job, following standard procedures." Jerome slowly rolled down his window completely for the first time since the stop began. "Officer Stevens, what standard procedure involves accusing someone of identity theft for claiming to be an attorney?" The question hung in the air unanswered because everyone present knew there was no reasonable answer. Detective Parker handed Jerome's license and registration back through the window. "Again, Mr. Washington, I sincerely apologize for this encounter. You're free to leave." Jerome accepted his documents but made no move to start his engine. "Detective, I appreciate your professionalism and willingness to verify facts rather than rely on assumptions. However, I'm concerned about the broader implications of what just occurred here." Morrison still held his phone, unsure whether to continue recording. The footage had captured everything, creating a permanent record of the encounter that could destroy careers and spark community outrage. "Mr. Washington," Hayes interjected, "I understand your concerns, but I think we can all agree this was an unfortunate misunderstanding. No harm was done, and the situation has been resolved." Jerome's legal mind immediately recognized the officer's attempt to minimize the encounter and discourage formal complaints. The phrase, "no harm was done," was particularly telling, suggesting they viewed racial profiling as harmless when it didn't result in physical violence. "Officer Hayes, I respectfully disagree that no harm was done. I was stopped for driving 6 miles over the speed limit and subjected to accusations of grand theft auto, identity theft, and fraud. Based on what evidence?" The question forced the officers to confront the uncomfortable truth underlying their actions. They had no evidence of criminal activity beyond Jerome's race and success. Stevens attempted to salvage the situation. "Sir, we received training about stolen vehicle indicators, expensive cars in certain neighborhoods, nervous behavior from drivers, inconsistent stories about identity. I wasn't nervous when you approached. I answered every question truthfully, and I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years. Detective Parker recognized that the encounter had moved beyond simple resolution. Jerome was demonstrating the analytical skills that made him successful as an attorney, systematically dismantling their justifications. The radio crackled with updates about the robbery call. "Units 23 and 45, suspects have fled the scene. Extend patrol perimeter to include residential areas." Hayes looked toward his patrol car, torn between responding to active police work and managing the developing crisis with Jerome. "Officers, I understand you have other duties," Jerome said calmly. "However, I want to ensure we're all clear about what occurred here tonight." He opened his car door slowly, emerging with his hands visible. At 6'2" and well-built, Jerome's presence was commanding but non-threatening. His expensive suit and dignified bearing created a stark contrast with the officer's earlier assumptions. Morrison stepped back instinctively, his hand moving toward his weapon before he caught himself. The unconscious reaction revealed how deeply ingrained his preconceptions were about black men. "Mr. Washington, please remain in your vehicle," Stevens said nervously. "Am I under arrest?" "No, sir." "Am I being detained?" "No, sir." Then I have the right to exit my vehicle and move freely. The exchange demonstrated Jerome's legal expertise while highlighting the officer's lack of legitimate authority to restrict his movements. Detective Parker intervened before the situation could escalate further. "Mr. Washington, you're absolutely right. You're free to move about as you choose." Jerome retrieved his briefcase from the passenger seat, opening it to reveal legal documents and files from the evening's Bar Association dinner. He selected a program from the event, showing his photograph and biography as the keynote speaker. "This is tonight's program from the State Bar Association annual dinner," he said, handing the document to Detective Parker. "My photograph is on page 3, along with my biographical information." Parker examined the program under her flashlight, noting the professional photography and detailed biography that matched the website information perfectly. Stevens watched nervously as more evidence accumulated supporting Jerome's identity. Each piece of verification made their initial assumptions appear more unreasonable and potentially discriminatory. "Sir, I think we've established your identity clearly," Stevens said, attempting to conclude the encounter. "You're free to go, and again, we apologize for any confusion." Jerome studied the officer's face, recognizing the attempt to minimize and dismiss what had occurred. "Officer Stevens, I want to be very clear about something. This wasn't confusion. This was racial profiling." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Stevens' face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Sir, that's completely unfair. Race had nothing to do with our actions tonight." "Then explain to me what evidence suggested I was driving a stolen vehicle." Stevens opened his mouth to respond, but found no reasonable answer. Every justification he might offer would reveal the racial assumptions underlying their approach. Morrison finally stopped recording, lowering his phone with the realization that the footage might become evidence in a civil rights complaint rather than documentation of criminal behavior. Detective Parker recognized that the situation required careful management to prevent escalation into a major incident with community and media implications. "Mr. Washington, I understand your frustration and concerns. From my perspective, this appears to have been a case of officers making assumptions without adequate evidence." Her diplomatic language acknowledged the problem while avoiding direct accusations against her fellow officers. Jerome appreciated her attempt at mediation but wasn't prepared to let the matter rest. "Detective, I've been practicing law for 20 years. I've represented clients in civil rights cases involving police misconduct. What happened here tonight follows a very familiar pattern." The mention of civil rights litigation sent alarm through the group of officers. Stevens particularly looked concerned about the potential legal consequences of their actions. Hayes decided to take a different approach. "Mr. Washington, speaking personally, I believe mistakes were made tonight. If you were in our position, how would you recommend we handle this situation moving forward?" The question surprised Jerome. Most officers in similar situations became defensive and dismissive, rather than seeking input about resolution. "Officer Hayes, I appreciate your willingness to engage constructively. First, I'd recommend acknowledging that racial bias influenced tonight's encounter. Second, I'd suggest reviewing your department's training about implicit bias and racial profiling." Stevens bristled at the suggestion. "We receive extensive training about bias and discrimination. This had nothing to do with race." "Officer Stevens, you assumed I was lying about being an attorney despite having no evidence to support that assumption. You assumed I was driving a stolen vehicle despite the registration matching my license. You assumed I was committing identity theft despite having no evidence of false identification. What evidence supported any of those assumptions?" The systematic dismantling of their logic left Stevens speechless. Every assumption could be traced back to disbelief
that a black man could legitimately possess what he owned and be who he claimed to be. Detective Parker's phone rang, interrupting the increasingly tense exchange. She answered quickly, speaking in low tones before hanging up. "Gentlemen, I need to respond to the robbery scene. The suspects may be armed and dangerous." Jerome nodded understandingly. "Detective, I don't want to prevent you from doing your job. However, I do want to ensure this matter receives appropriate attention. Mr. Washington, I'll personally review this incident and follow up with you tomorrow. You have my commitment that this will be handled properly." Her promise carried weight because of her professional reputation and the respect she'd shown throughout the encounter. Stevens and Morrison looked relieved at the prospect of ending the encounter and moving on to other duties. Their relief was premature. Jerome reached into his briefcase again, retrieving a business card and pen. "Detective Parker, here's my contact information. I'll expect to hear from you by close of business tomorrow." He handed cards to each of the officers present. "Gentlemen, I want you to understand that this encounter will have consequences. Not punitive consequences necessarily, but educational ones." Hayes accepted his card respectfully. "Sir, I appreciate your professionalism throughout this encounter. You handled a difficult situation with remarkable composure." Officer Hayes: "Composure under pressure is a survival skill I learned early in life. Tonight's encounter reminded me why it's necessary." The observation carried implications that resonated with Detective Parker, who had witnessed similar situations throughout her career. Stevens took his card reluctantly, still unwilling to fully acknowledge the problematic nature of their actions. "Mr. Washington, I hope you understand we were just doing our jobs."
Jerome studied the officer's face, seeing a man unable to grasp how his assumptions had created an unjust and potentially dangerous situation. "Officer Stevens, I understand you believe that, but I want you to consider something. If doing your job involves assuming successful black professionals are criminals, perhaps the problem isn't with black professionals." The statement landed with devastating clarity. Even Stevens couldn't ignore the logic, though accepting it would require acknowledging uncomfortable truths about his own biases. Morrison had remained largely silent since the recording ended, processing the implications of what had occurred and what he had captured on video. "Mr. Washington," Morrison said finally, "what happens to the recording I made?" Jerome considered the question carefully. The footage could serve multiple purposes, from evidence in a civil rights complaint to educational material for police training. "Officer Morrison, that recording documents everything that occurred here tonight. I trust you'll preserve it properly and make it available for any official review process." The implication was clear. The video evidence would support Jerome's account of events and potentially contradict any attempt to minimize or mischaracterize the encounter. Detective Parker gathered the other officers for a brief conference away from Jerome's vehicle. Their whispered discussion was urgent and clearly focused on damage control. Jerome used the moment to assess his options and plan his next steps. As an attorney and Bar Association president, he had responsibilities that extended beyond his personal experience. The officers returned from their conference looking subdued. Detective Parker served as their spokesman. "Mr. Washington, we want to thank you for your cooperation and patience tonight. We also want to assure you that this incident will receive appropriate review and attention." Jerome nodded acknowledgement while noting the careful language designed to sound reassuring without making specific commitments. "Detective, I appreciate those assurances. I also want you to know that I'll be discussing tonight's events with appropriate parties, including Bar Association leadership and community organizations." The statement served as notice that the encounter wouldn't remain a private matter between Jerome and the officers involved. Stevens looked increasingly uncomfortable as the broader implications became clear. A discrimination complaint by the Bar Association president would likely attract significant attention from media, community leaders, and police department administration. "Sir," Stevens said desperately, I hope you'll consider that we were responding to what appeared to be suspicious circumstances. We weren't trying to discriminate against anyone." Jerome studied the officer's face, recognizing genuine concern mixed with self-serving damage control. "Officer Stevens, I want to believe your intentions weren't discriminatory, but impact matters more than intent. The impact of tonight's encounter was that I was treated as a criminal suspect for being a successful black professional." The distinction between intent and impact was fundamental to civil rights law, and Jerome's articulation of it demonstrated his legal expertise while highlighting the officer's lack of understanding about discrimination. Detective Parker checked her watch, noting the time pressure to respond to the robbery scene. "Mr. Washington, I need to leave for another call. You have my commitment that we'll follow up properly on this incident." Jerome shook her hand respectfully. "Detective, I appreciate your professionalism and look forward to hearing from you." As the officers began walking back toward their patrol cars, Jerome called out one final time. "Gentlemen, I want to leave you with one thought. Tonight you met a successful black attorney and assumed he was a criminal. Tomorrow you might encounter a young black man and make similar assumptions. That young man might not have Harvard law degree and 20 years of legal experience to protect him. What happens to him?" The question pierced through all the rationalizations and excuses, focusing on the broader implications of their biases for community members who lacked Jerome's education, experience, and social position. Stevens stopped walking but didn't turn around. His shoulders sagged with the weight of implications he'd never previously considered. Hayes paused longer, looking back at Jerome with something approaching respect. "Sir, that's a question I'll be thinking about." Detective Parker nodded grimly, understanding that Jerome's question highlighted the most troubling aspect of police bias. The encounter's outcome had been positive only because of Jerome's unique position and skills. As the officers drove away, their red and blue lights disappearing into the night, Jerome remained beside his Mercedes processing what had occurred. The traffic stop that began as routine harassment had evolved into a teachable moment with implications extending far beyond one evening's encounter. Jerome looked at his watch, noting that less than 2 hours had passed since he left the Bar Association dinner. The contrast between the respectful treatment he'd received there and the suspicion he'd encountered here illustrated the complex reality of success while black in America. He started his engine and began the short drive home, his mind already formulating the conversations he would need to have and the actions he would need to take. The evening was far from over, and the real work was just beginning. Jerome's hands remained steady on the steering wheel as he completed the final 3 blocks to his home, but his mind raced through the implications of what had just occurred. The tree-lined streets of his upscale neighborhood looked exactly as they had 2 hours earlier. But everything had changed. His house appeared through the darkness, a 2-story colonial with warm lights glowing in the windows. His wife Denise would be waiting, probably reading in the living room as she did most evenings when he worked late. Jerome pulled into his circular driveway, noting the automatic security lights that illuminated his approach. The same lights had been invisible during his departure for the Bar Association dinner, when the evening held only promise and professional accomplishment. He sat in his car for several minutes, processing the encounter and planning his next steps. As Bar Association president, he couldn't treat this as a personal matter. The implications extended to every attorney of color, every professional who might face similar assumptions, every community member who lacked his advantages. The front door opened before Jerome reached it. Denise stood silhouetted against the warm interior light, her expression shifting from welcome to concern as she read his face. "How was the dinner?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already sensed complications. Jerome embraced his wife of 15 years, drawing comfort from her familiar presence. Denise had been his partner through law school, the early years of practice, and his rise to partnership. She understood the unique pressures of being a successful black professional. The dinner was wonderful. The drive home was problematic. Denise led him into their living room, a space decorated with law school diplomas, professional awards, and family photographs. The environment represented security and achievement, making the evening's encounter feel even more jarring. Jerome settled into his favorite chair, loosening his tie completely for the first time that evening. I was pulled over for driving 6 miles over the speed limit. The officers accused me of driving a stolen car and using false identification. Denise's expression hardened with familiar anger. After 15 years of marriage to a successful black attorney, she'd heard similar stories from Jerome's colleagues and clients. But experiencing it personally was different. What happened exactly? Jerome recounted the encounter in detail, his legal training providing precise recall of conversations and events. Denise listened without interruption, her expression growing grimmer with each detail. They assumed you were lying about being an attorney? They assumed I was lying about everything. My profession, my education, my identity. Officer Stevens seemed convinced I was some elaborate criminal using stolen documents and a stolen car. Denise shook her head with bitter understanding. Because successful black men are so statistically improbable that criminal behavior is more likely. Jerome nodded grimly. That's exactly the logic. Detective Parker eventually verified my bar association membership, but only after I specifically suggested she check. What's your next step? The question forced Jerome to articulate plans that had been forming during the drive home. I need to file a formal complaint with the police department. I need to discuss this with bar association leadership, and I need to consider broader community implications. Denise understood the weight her husband carried as one of the state's most prominent black attorneys. His position came with responsibilities that extended beyond personal success to community advocacy and professional representation. Have you considered media attention? Jerome had been thinking about exactly that issue. Media attention would certainly raise awareness about police bias, but it might also turn this into a circus rather than a learning opportunity. His phone rang, interrupting their conversation. The caller ID showed the name of Robert Sterling, the senior partner at Jerome's law firm. Robert, good to hear from you. Sterling's voice carried concern and urgency. Jerome, I just received a very interesting phone call from Detective Lisa Parker. She wanted to verify your identity and professional standing. Jerome felt a spark of appreciation for Detective Parker's thoroughness. Following up with his law firm demonstrated professional integrity and genuine concern about the encounter's implications. What did you tell her? I confirmed everything, obviously. Your partnership status, bar association presidency, tonight's keynote speech. But Jerome, what the hell happened out there? Jerome provided Sterling with a concise summary of the traffic stop, focusing on the officer's assumptions and accusations. Sterling listened with growing concern and anger. Jesus Christ, Jerome. This is exactly the kind of incident that creates massive liability for police departments. And frankly, it's the kind of experience that drives talented attorneys away from community involvement. Sterling's perspective was both personal and strategic. As senior partner of one of the state's most prestigious law firms, he understood the broader implications of police bias against successful professionals. Robert, I'm going to handle this carefully and professionally, but I can't let it slide. I wouldn't expect you to. And you'll have the firm's full support for whatever action you decide to take. After ending the call, Jerome found Denise waiting with 2 cups of coffee and the concerned expression of a wife who understood her husband faced difficult decisions. The firm's backing you? Absolutely. Robert's furious about what happened. Denise settled beside Jerome on their couch, the comfortable space where they discussed countless professional challenges over the years. What about the bar association? How do you handle this as president? The question highlighted the complexity of Jerome's situation. As an individual, he could file complaints and pursue personal remedies. As Bar Association president, he had broader responsibilities to address systemic issues affecting all attorneys. I need to call an emergency meeting with the executive committee. This incident raises questions about police bias that affect every attorney of color in our state. Jerome's phone buzzed with text messages that had been arriving since he'd gotten home. Word was already spreading through legal and professional networks about the evening's encounter. The first message was from his law school classmate Kenneth Johnson, now a federal judge. Heard about your traffic stop. This is unacceptable. Call me. Another was from Tiffany Davis, president of the National Bar Association's local chapter. Jerome, we need to discuss tonight's incident. Community response is building. A third message came from Gregory Williams, a civil rights attorney who specialized in police misconduct cases. Saw social media posts about your encounter. We should talk about legal options. Jerome showed the messages to Denise, who shook her head with bitter familiarity. The Black Professional Network is already mobilizing, because they understand this could happen to any of us. Jerome's laptop chimed with email notifications. He opened it to find messages from attorneys, judges, and professional organizations across the state. News of the Bar Association president's traffic stop was spreading rapidly through legal circles. One email particularly caught his attention. It was from Donna Harris, the dean of his law school and a prominent civil rights advocate. Jerome, I've heard disturbing reports about your encounter with police tonight. This incident has implications that extend far beyond individual harassment. We need to discuss institutional responses that can create lasting change rather than temporary outrage. The message resonated with Jerome's own thinking about transforming the incident into meaningful reform rather than simply seeking personal vindication. His phone rang again. This time the caller was Melvin Jackson, mayor of their city and a longtime political ally. Jerome, I've received calls from several sources about your traffic stop tonight. I want you to know that this will receive my personal attention. Jerome appreciated the mayor's support, but recognized the political calculations involved. Melvin couldn't afford to ignore discrimination against prominent community members, especially when it involved police officers under his administrative oversight. Mayor Jackson, I appreciate your concern. I'm still processing what happened and determining appropriate responses. Jerome, I want you to know that Police Chief Sullivan will be reviewing this matter personally. If officers acted inappropriately, there will be consequences. The promise sounded reassuring, but Jerome's legal experience made him skeptical of administrative assurances without concrete accountability measures. I'll be filing formal complaints through appropriate channels. But I'm more interested in systematic change than individual punishment. After ending the call, Jerome realized the evening had transformed from personal harassment into a community incident with political implications. His response would be scrutinized by supporters and critics alike. Denise observed her husband's contemplative silence. You're thinking about bigger picture responses. I'm thinking about the young black law student who might face the same assumptions in 5 years. I'm thinking about the successful black businessman who doesn't have Harvard law credentials to protect him. Jerome's perspective extended beyond his own experience to encompass broader community impacts. His position as Bar Association president carried responsibilities that required thinking systemically rather than personally. What would meaningful change look like? Jerome had been considering exactly that question. Comprehensive bias training for all police officers, community oversight of police interactions, data collection about traffic stops and arrests broken down by race and income. His phone buzzed with another call. The caller ID showed Brenda Thompson, an investigative journalist with the state's largest newspaper. Jerome looked at Denise questioningly. Answering would likely result in media coverage that could amplify the issue but also create complications. Take it, Denise advised. Control the narrative before others control it for you. Ms. Thompson, this is Jerome Washington. Mr. Washington, I've received reports about a traffic stop involving you this evening. I'm hoping you might provide your perspective on what occurred. Jerome recognized the careful language journalists used when developing potentially explosive stories. Thompson's reputation for thorough investigation and fair reporting made her a relatively trustworthy option for initial media engagement. Ms. Thompson, I can confirm that I was stopped for a minor traffic violation and questioned extensively about my identity and profession. The encounter raised concerns about police bias that I'm currently reviewing. Are you planning to file formal complaints? I'm considering various responses, including formal complaints, community education initiatives, and policy reform proposals. Thompson's questions continued for several minutes, focusing on specific details of the encounter and Jerome's planned responses. Her approach was professional and balanced, avoiding sensationalism while pursuing important questions. After ending the interview, Jerome knew that media coverage was now inevitable. The story would likely appear in tomorrow's newspaper, potentially sparking broader community discussion and reaction. Denise had been listening to his careful responses to Thompson's questions. "You handled that well," factual without being inflammatory. The challenge is maintaining that balance while ensuring meaningful change results from tonight's experience. Jerome's laptop showed 17 new emails, mostly from legal colleagues expressing support and offering assistance. The professional network's rapid mobilization demonstrated how deeply the incident had resonated within legal community.
One email stood out from the others. It was from Captain James Fletcher, the police department's internal affairs.
"Mr. Washington, I've been informed about tonight's traffic stop. I'd like to schedule a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss the incident and our department's response." The message suggested that police administration was taking the matter seriously, possibly due to Jerome's prominent position and the potential for public controversy. Jerome showed the email to Denise, who read it with raised eyebrows. "Internal affairs is already involved?" "Probably damage control. They know this could become a major issue if handled poorly." Jerome's experience with police misconduct cases had taught him to be skeptical of quick administrative responses. Often, early engagement was designed to minimize problems rather than address underlying issues. His phone showed a text message from Detective Parker. "Mr. Washington, I've initiated a formal review of tonight's encounter. I'll contact you tomorrow with updates on our investigation." The message demonstrated Parker's commitment to following through on her promises, distinguishing her from the other officers involved in the stop. Jerome began drafting responses to the most important emails and messages he'd received. Each response required careful consideration of tone, content, and implications for various audiences. To Judge Kenneth Johnson, he wrote, "Kenneth, thank you for your concern. Tonight's incident highlights issues we've discussed regarding police bias against successful Black professionals. I'm planning systematic responses rather than purely personal remedies." To Tiffany Davis from the National Bar Association, he wrote, "Tiffany, we should definitely discuss community response strategies. This incident provides an opportunity to address police bias comprehensively rather than reactively." To Gregory Williams, the civil rights attorney, he wrote, "Gregory, I appreciate your offer of assistance. My focus is on institutional change rather than individual litigation, but your expertise in police reform would be valuable." Each message required balancing personal gratitude with professional strategy and community responsibility. Denise reviewed his draft responses, offering suggestions for tone and content. Her perspective as a successful Black professional in her own right provided valuable insight into community dynamics and potential responses. "You're striking the right balance between acknowledging the problem and focusing on solutions." Jerome's approach reflected his legal training and leadership experience. Rather than responding emotionally to discrimination, he was channeling anger into strategic action designed to prevent similar incidents. The living room clock showed 11:30 p.m. What had begun as a celebration of professional achievement had evolved into crisis management and strategic planning. "We should get some sleep," Denise suggested. "Tomorrow is going to be complicated." Jerome nodded, knowing that tomorrow would bring media coverage, community meetings, and difficult conversations with police administrators and political leaders. As they prepared for bed, Jerome reflected on the evening's events and their broader implications. The traffic stop had lasted less than an hour, but its consequences would likely extend for months or years. The encounter with Officers Stevens and Morrison had revealed assumptions and biases that affected not just Jerome, but every successful Black professional in their community. The question now was whether those revelations would lead to meaningful change or simply temporary embarrassment for the officers involved. Jerome's position as Bar Association president gave him unique opportunities to transform personal harassment into systematic reform. The challenge would be maintaining focus on institutional change while managing the inevitable political and media attention. Before turning off his phone for the night, Jerome checked social media to gauge community reaction. The traffic stop was already being discussed on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, with reactions ranging from outrage to support to skepticism. Some comments focused on racial bias in policing. Others questioned why successful black professionals continued facing discrimination. A few suggested Jerome was overreacting to routine police work. The mixed reactions reminded Jerome that community responses to police bias were never uniform. Some people understood the incident's broader implications immediately, while others required education about systemic discrimination. Jerome's final act before sleep was reviewing his calendar for tomorrow. 3 court appearances, 2 client meetings, and a bar association conference call that would now include discussion of his traffic stop. The schedule would need adjustment to accommodate media interviews, police meetings, and community conversations that had become necessary following the evening's encounter. As Jerome finally settled into bed, he thought about Officer Hayes' parting question about what happened to young black men who lacked his advantages and credentials. That question would guide his response strategy and determine whether the night's humiliation could be transformed into meaningful progress. The encounter was ending, but the real work was just beginning. Morning sunlight filtered through Jerome's bedroom windows as his alarm sounded at 6:30 a.m. The events of the previous evening felt surreal in daylight, like a disturbing dream that lingered despite consciousness. But the stack of missed calls and text messages on his phone confirmed the incident's harsh reality. Denise was already awake, sitting at their kitchen table with coffee and her tablet displaying the morning news. Her expression told Jerome everything he needed to know before she spoke. "The story broke an hour ago," she said quietly, turning the tablet screen toward him. The headline read, "Bar Association President Stopped by Police, Accused of Driving Stolen Car." The article was accompanied by Jerome's professional photograph and quotes from the interview with journalist Brenda Thompson. Jerome scanned the article quickly, noting Thompson's balanced reporting that presented facts without inflammatory language. The piece included statements from the police department acknowledging an ongoing investigation. "How's the reaction?" Denise scrolled through social media feeds showing hundreds of comments, shares, and reactions. Mixed, as expected. Strong support from legal community. Outrage from civil rights groups. Some people questioning whether you're overreacting. Jerome's phone rang before he could respond. The caller ID showed Captain James Fletcher from Internal Affairs. "Captain Fletcher, good morning." "Mr. Washington, thank you for taking my call. I'd like to meet with you today to discuss last night's incident. Would you be available this afternoon?" Jerome appreciated the captain's direct approach, but recognized the political urgency behind the quick response. "Captain, I can meet at 2 p.m. I'd like to bring my attorney." "Of course. We want to handle this matter thoroughly and professionally." The conversation was brief and formal, setting the tone for what would likely be a carefully managed investigation designed to minimize embarrassment for the department. Jerome's next call was to Gregory Williams, the civil rights attorney who had offered assistance the previous evening. "Gregory, I have a meeting with Internal Affairs this afternoon. I'd like you to accompany me." Williams accepted immediately, understanding the importance of experienced representation during police investigations. "Jerome, I've been following social media reaction to your story. This has struck a nerve in the community. That's what I'm hoping to leverage for systematic change. We need to discuss strategy before the Internal Affairs meeting. Can you meet me at my office at noon?" Jerome agreed, appreciating Williams' systematic approach to police misconduct cases. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Parker. "Mr. Washington, I've completed my initial report on last night's encounter. I'd like to discuss my findings with you at your convenience." The message suggested Parker was taking the investigation seriously and had discovered information that supported Jerome's account of events. Jerome forwarded Parker's message to Williams with a note. "Detective Parker seems to be conducting a genuine investigation. May be worth including her in our strategy discussions." The morning continued with calls from reporters, colleagues, and community leaders. Jerome carefully managed each conversation, providing consistent messaging about seeking systematic change rather than personal vindication. Judge Kenneth Johnson called to offer support and insight about dealing with police misconduct cases from a judicial perspective. Jerome, the legal community is watching how this case is handled. It could set precedents for how police bias against attorneys is addressed. Mayor Melvin Jackson called to provide updates on his conversations with Police Chief Sullivan. Jerome, the chief assures me this incident will receive thorough investigation. He's committed to appropriate consequences if officers acted improperly. Jerome appreciated the political support but remained focused on institutional reforms that would prevent similar incidents rather than simply punishing individual officers. At 11:30 a.m., Jerome arrived at Gregory Williams' law office, a modest building that housed one of the state's most effective civil rights practices. Williams specialized in police misconduct cases and had developed expertise in transforming individual incidents into systematic reforms. Williams' conference room was decorated with newspaper clippings and photographs documenting successful civil rights cases. The environment reflected decades of fighting institutional discrimination and winning meaningful change. Jerome, let's review what we know and plan our approach for the internal affairs meeting. Williams had compiled a comprehensive file including social media posts, news articles, and legal precedents related to racial profiling cases. His preparation was thorough and strategic. First, let's establish the facts clearly. You were stopped for driving 6 miles over the speed limit. The officers immediately escalated to accusations of grand theft auto and identity fraud based solely on disbelief that you could legitimately be a successful attorney. Jerome confirmed the sequence of events, providing additional details about Officer Stevens's increasingly aggressive assumptions and Morrison's decision to record the encounter. The recording could be crucial evidence, Williams noted. It documents their assumptions and escalating accusations without any supporting evidence. Williams outlined strategy for the internal affairs meeting. Remain factual, avoid emotional responses, focus on policy violations rather than personal grievances, and emphasize systematic reforms over individual punishment. Jerome, your position as Bar Association president gives us unique leverage. Police departments can't afford to alienate the legal community, especially over clear cases of bias.
At 12:30 p.m., Detective Parker arrived at Williams' office for the pre-meeting consultation. Her presence surprised Jerome, who hadn't expected her to participate in strategy discussions. "Mr. Washington, I wanted to share my findings before the internal affairs meeting. My investigation supports your account of events completely." Parker had reviewed body camera footage from all officers involved, conducted interviews with witnesses, and analyzed the timeline of events. Her conclusions were damning for Officers Stevens and Morrison. "Officer Stevens made assumptions about your criminal behavior without any supporting evidence. Officer Morrison continued recording after it became clear you were telling the truth about your identity. Both officers failed to follow department protocols for bias prevention." Williams took detailed notes as Parker described policy violations and procedural failures. "Detective, are you willing to present these findings at the internal affairs meeting?" "Absolutely. I believe accountability is essential for maintaining community trust." Jerome appreciated Parker's integrity and commitment to professional standards over colleague loyalty.
At 1:45 p.m., the group traveled to police headquarters for the internal affairs meeting. The building's imposing architecture reflected institutional authority, but Jerome felt confident with Williams and Parker supporting his position. Captain Fletcher met them in the lobby, his demeanor professional but clearly concerned about the political implications of the case. "Mr. Washington, thank you for coming. We want to resolve this matter appropriately." The internal affairs conference room was sterile and formal, designed to intimidate subjects and witnesses. Jerome's legal experience made him comfortable in such environments. but he understood why most citizens found police investigations intimidating. Present at the meeting were Captain Fletcher, Internal Affairs Lieutenant Rebecca Hayes, Police Chief Andrew Sullivan, and a department attorney whose presence suggested serious legal concerns about the incident. Chief Sullivan opened the meeting with carefully prepared remarks. Mr. Washington, first let me apologize for any inappropriate treatment you received last night. Our department is committed to professional service for all community members. Jerome appreciated the apology, but recognized political damage control rather than genuine accountability. Chief Sullivan, I appreciate your words, but I'm more interested in systematic changes that prevent similar incidents than in apologies. Williams presented Jerome's account of events systematically, emphasizing policy violations and discriminatory assumptions. His presentation was factual and professional, avoiding inflammatory language while highlighting serious misconduct. Detective Parker then presented her investigation findings, providing detailed documentation of the officer's assumptions and escalating accusations. Her report was thorough and damaging to Stevens and Morrison's credibility. Based on my investigation, Officers Stevens and Morrison violated multiple department policies regarding bias prevention, evidence-based decision-making, and professional conduct. Captain Fletcher reviewed Parker's findings with visible concern. The documented policy violations created liability for the department and required disciplinary action. Chief Sullivan addressed Jerome directly. Mr. Washington, what would you consider appropriate resolution of this matter? The question provided Jerome with the opportunity to focus on systematic reforms rather than individual punishment. Chief Sullivan, I want comprehensive bias training for all officers, data collection about traffic stops broken down by race and income, and community oversight of police interactions. Jerome's reform proposals were specific and measurable, reflecting his legal experience with institutional change processes. The police attorney took detailed notes, clearly calculating legal and financial implications of Jerome's proposals. Implementing comprehensive reforms would be expensive but potentially less costly than civil rights litigation and federal oversight. Lieutenant Hayes raised practical concerns about implementation timelines and resource requirements. Mr. Washington, some of your proposals would require significant budget allocations and staff retraining. Jerome had anticipated cost objections and prepared responses based on successful police reform initiatives in other jurisdictions. Lieutenant, I've researched similar programs in cities our size. The costs are manageable and typically result in improved community relations and reduced litigation expenses. Williams supported Jerome's proposals with legal precedents and federal requirements for police departments with histories of discriminatory practices. These reforms align with Justice Department guidelines for constitutional policing. Chief Sullivan recognized that resisting Jerome's proposals would likely result in more expensive alternatives, including federal investigation and community protests. Mr. Washington, we're willing to work with you on implementation of appropriate reforms. The commitment sounded promising, but Jerome's legal experience made him skeptical of administrative promises without concrete accountability measures. Chief Sullivan, I'd like written commitments with specific timelines and measurable outcomes. I'm also requesting regular progress reports to community stakeholders. The meeting continued for 2 hours with detailed discussions of implementation strategies, budget requirements, and accountability measures. Jerome's systematic approach impressed even the police administrators who had initially seemed defensive. Captain Fletcher concluded the meeting with specific commitments: disciplinary action for Officers Stevens and Morrison, mandatory bias training for all patrol officers within 6 months, and quarterly reports on traffic stop demographics. Mr. Washington, you'll receive written confirmation of these commitments within 48 hours. Jerome appreciated the concrete promises, but planned to maintain pressure for full implementation rather than trusting administrative good faith. Outside police headquarters, Williams congratulated Jerome on the meeting's outcome. You handled that perfectly. Factual, professional, focused on solutions rather than punishment. Detective Parker joined them in the parking lot, looking relieved that the department was taking serious action. Mr. Washington, I want you to know that many officers support the reforms you've proposed. We want to serve the community professionally.
Jerome shook Parker's hand gratefully. Detective, your integrity throughout this process has been exemplary. Officers like you give me hope for meaningful police reform. The drive back to Williams' office provided time for strategic planning about community communication and media relations. Jerome needed to present the internal affairs meeting results in ways that maintained pressure for reform while acknowledging positive steps. Williams suggested a press conference to announce the police department's commitments and maintain public accountability. Jerome, community pressure will be essential for ensuring full implementation of the reforms. Jerome agreed, understanding that public attention would be necessary to prevent the commitments from being quietly abandoned after media attention faded. His phone showed dozens of missed calls and messages from reporters, community leaders, and legal colleagues seeking updates on the investigation. Each conversation would require careful management to maintain momentum for reform. The afternoon had produced concrete commitments from police leadership. But Jerome understood that real change would require sustained advocacy and community engagement over months or years. Detective Parker's investigation had provided documentation of discriminatory behavior that strengthened Jerome's position significantly. The internal affairs process, while still ongoing, had already produced acknowledgement of policy violations. Most importantly, Jerome's systematic approach to seeking reforms rather than personal remedies had positioned him as a community leader focused on institutional change rather than individual grievance. The traffic stop that had begun as personal harassment was evolving into a catalyst for police reform, with implications extending far beyond Jerome's individual experience. As the afternoon ended, Jerome reflected on the progress made in less than 24 hours. Community mobilization, media attention, and professional support had transformed a discriminatory encounter into leverage for systematic change. The real test would come in the months ahead, as police commitments were either implemented meaningfully or allowed to fade without accountability. Jerome's position as Bar Association president provided unique opportunities to maintain pressure for reform while supporting officers like Detective Parker who demonstrated genuine commitment to professional policing. The investigation phase was concluding, but the reform implementation phase was just beginning. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the Bar Association's main conference room, a space chosen deliberately to emphasize Jerome's institutional authority and professional standing. By 9:30, reporters from 6 news organizations had assembled with cameras, microphones, and notebooks. Jerome reviewed his prepared statement one final time with Denise and Gregory Williams. The message needed to balance acknowledgement of police commitments with emphasis on the need for sustained community oversight and accountability. Remember, the goal is maintaining pressure for implementation while recognizing positive steps, Williams advised. Don't let them claim victory prematurely. At exactly 10 a.m., Jerome entered the conference room, accompanied by Tiffany Davis from the National Bar Association, Judge Kenneth Johnson, and Mayor Melvin Jackson. The diverse coalition demonstrated broad community support for police reform. Jerome began with a detailed account of the traffic stop, emphasizing the officer's assumptions and escalating accusations. His presentation was factual and professional, avoiding inflammatory language while clearly documenting discriminatory behavior. I was stopped for driving 6 miles over the speed limit and subjected to accusations of grand theft auto and identity fraud based solely on Officers Stevens and Morrison's disbelief that a black man could legitimately be a successful attorney. The reporters took detailed notes. As Jerome described the encounter's progression and Detective Parker's professional response, several asked follow-up questions about specific details and timeline. Mr. Washington, what evidence did the officers have to support their assumptions about criminal behavior? asked Channel 7's investigative reporter. None whatsoever. Every assumption was based on their inability to accept that a black professional could own an expensive vehicle and possess legitimate credentials. Jerome then outlined the police department's commitments resulting from the internal affairs investigation, disciplinary action for the involved officers, mandatory bias training, demographic data collection, and community oversight mechanisms. These commitments represent significant progress, but implementation will require sustained community attention and accountability. Tiffany Davis spoke next, placing Jerome's experience within broader patterns of discrimination against black professionals. This incident highlights systematic biases that affect successful black Americans across all professions and communities. Judge Johnson emphasized the legal community's commitment to supporting police reform initiatives. The Bar Association will monitor implementation of these commitments closely and report progress to community stakeholders regularly. Mayor Jackson provided political context and administrative support for the reform proposals. Our city is committed to professional policing that serves all residents equally. These reforms align with our values and policies. The questions from reporters focused on implementation timelines, enforcement mechanisms, and potential consequences if police commitments weren't fulfilled. Mr. Washington, what happens if the police department fails to implement the promised reforms? Asked the newspaper's investigative team leader. Jerome had prepared for exactly that question. We'll pursue federal oversight, civil rights, litigation, and sustained community pressure until meaningful change is achieved. The press conference lasted 45 minutes, with Jerome maintaining control of messaging while providing substantive answers to legitimate questions. Media coverage would be crucial for maintaining public attention during the reform implementation phase. Following the press conference, Jerome returned to his law firm to handle the accumulating casework that had been delayed by the previous day's crisis management. Senior partner Robert Sterling had rearranged schedules to accommodate Jerome's community responsibilities. Take whatever time you need to see this through properly. Sterling's support reflected both personal principle and business calculation. The law firm's reputation was enhanced by Jerome's principled leadership on civil rights issues. Jerome's phone showed 17 new voicemails from reporters, community leaders, and professional colleagues. Each call represented opportunities to build coalition support or potential complications requiring careful management. The first voicemail was from Congresswoman Linda Foster, whose district included their city. Jerome, I've been following your case closely. I'd like to discuss federal legislation that could address police bias more comprehensively. Federal involvement would elevate the issue beyond local reform to national policy implications, potentially benefiting communities across the country while increasing pressure on local police administration. Another message came from Dr. Beverly Carter, president of the state's largest civil rights organization. Jerome, we're organizing community meetings to maintain momentum for police reform. Your participation would be valuable. Community organizing would be essential for ensuring sustained pressure during the implementation phase when media attention inevitably decreased and administrative promises faced budget and bureaucratic obstacles. A third message was from Detective Parker. Mr. Washington, I wanted to update you on the internal investigation progress. Both officers, Stevens and Morrison, have been suspended pending completion of disciplinary proceedings. The suspensions represented concrete consequences for discriminatory behavior, though Jerome remained focused on systematic reforms rather than individual punishment. Jerome's afternoon was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Officer Hayes, who had been present at the traffic stop, arrived at his law firm requesting a private meeting. Hayes appeared uncomfortable and uncertain, clearly struggling with the implications of the incident and his role in events. "Mr. Washington, I wanted to apologize personally for what happened that night." Jerome appreciated the gesture, but recognized an opportunity for education and alliance building with officers who demonstrated capacity for growth and change. "Officer Hayes, I appreciate your apology, but I'm more interested in your commitment to preventing similar incidents in the future." Hayes nodded earnestly. "Sir, that encounter made me realize how my own assumptions can contribute to discriminatory policing. I want to be part of the solution." The conversation continued for 30 minutes, with Jerome explaining the broader implications of police bias, and Hayes asking thoughtful questions about implicit bias recognition and intervention strategies. "Officer Hayes, officers like you who are willing to examine their own biases and advocate for professional standards are essential for meaningful police reform." Hayes left the meeting with reading materials about bias prevention and contact information for training organizations that could help him develop better community policing skills. Jerome's phone rang immediately after Hayes departed. The caller was Captain Fletcher with updates on the internal affairs investigation. "Mr. Washington, I wanted to inform you that we've completed interviews with all witnesses and reviewed all available evidence. Our findings support your account completely." Fletcher's investigation had documented multiple policy violations by Stevens and Morrison, creating strong foundation for disciplinary action and supporting Jerome's reform proposals. "Captain, what disciplinary measures are being considered?" "That's still under review, but I can assure you the consequences will be appropriate for the seriousness of the violations." Jerome appreciated Fletcher's professionalism while maintaining focus on systematic reforms rather than individual punishment. "Captain, my primary concern remains implementation of the bias prevention measures we discussed." "Mr. Washington, those reforms are moving forward according to the timeline we established. You'll receive the first progress report next week." The conversation concluded with Fletcher's commitment to maintaining communication throughout the implementation process. Jerome's evening was devoted to community meetings with civil rights organizations, professional associations, and neighborhood groups. Each meeting required tailored messaging while maintaining consistent themes about systematic reform and accountability. At the NAACP chapter meeting, Jerome emphasized the incident's connection to broader patterns of discrimination affecting community members without his professional advantages and social position. This traffic stop revealed assumptions and biases that affect every successful Black professional in our community. But, more importantly, it highlighted the danger faced by young Black men who lack legal credentials and social connections. The audience responded with recognition and appreciation for Jerome's focus on community-wide implications, rather than personal grievance. At the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce gathering, Jerome connected police bias issues to broader patterns of discrimination, affecting all minority communities. Bias training and accountability measures benefit everyone who has been subjected to assumptions based on race, ethnicity, or appearance. Building coalitions across different communities would be essential for maintaining political pressure during the lengthy implementation process. The neighborhood association meeting in Jerome's own upscale community required different messaging, focusing on public safety and professional policing benefits rather than civil rights themes. Effective police training and accountability measures improve public safety for everyone while reducing liability and litigation costs for our city. Jerome's ability to adapt his messaging to different audiences while maintaining core principles demonstrated the political skills that had made him successful as Bar Association president. The day concluded with a strategy session including Gregory Williams, Tiffany Davis, and Dr. 24K, Beverly Carter. The group reviewed media coverage, community responses, and next steps for maintaining momentum. Media coverage had been generally positive and factual, with editorial support for the proposed reforms appearing in both major newspapers. Television coverage had focused on the dramatic elements of the traffic stop while including substantive discussion of policy implications. Social media responses remained mixed, but showed growing support for police accountability measures and bias prevention training. Online discussions had expanded beyond the initial incident to broader conversations about discrimination and institutional reform. Jerome, you've successfully transformed a personal incident into a community movement for systematic change, Dr. Carter observed. The challenge now is sustaining momentum through the implementation phase. Williams outlined legal strategies for maintaining pressure if police commitments weren't fulfilled according to promised timelines. We need to be prepared for bureaucratic delays and budget excuses. Tiffany Davis described coordination with other bar associations and legal organizations to monitor implementation and provide technical assistance for bias prevention training. This case is being watched by legal communities across the country. Success here could influence police reform efforts in other cities.
The strategy session continued until nearly midnight, with detailed planning for community organizing, media relations, and accountability mechanisms that would be necessary over the coming months. Jerome drove home through the same streets where he'd been stopped 3 days earlier, noting the irony that the location had transformed from a site of humiliation into the catalyst for community-wide reform efforts. Denise was waiting with updates on social media responses and messages from friends and colleagues across the country. You're becoming a national symbol for police accountability and professional dignity. Jerome appreciated the recognition while remaining focused on local implementation of concrete reforms. The real measure of success will be whether young black professionals face different treatment from police a year from now. The community response phase had exceeded expectations, with broad coalition support and sustained media attention. The next phase would test whether community pressure could ensure full implementation of police commitments. Jerome's experience had demonstrated how individual incidents of discrimination could be transformed into catalysts for institutional change through strategic communication, community organizing, and sustained advocacy. The traffic stop was ending, but the reform movement was just beginning to build momentum that could create lasting change for future generations. 3 weeks after the traffic stop, Jerome sat in the police department's main conference room surrounded by community leaders, civil rights advocates, and police administrators for the first quarterly accountability meeting. The room's atmosphere was markedly different from the internal affairs encounter, with genuine collaboration replacing defensive posturing. Police Chief Sullivan began the meeting by presenting implementation progress on the reform commitments. We've completed bias prevention training for 847 officers across all departments. Community feedback has been overwhelmingly positive about improved interactions. Jerome reviewed the training curriculum materials, noting comprehensive coverage of implicit bias recognition, cultural competency, and de-escalation techniques. The content exceeded his initial expectations and reflected genuine commitment to change. Chief Sullivan, what data do you have about traffic stop demographics since implementation began? Chief Sullivan handed out detailed statistical reports showing traffic stops broken down by race, neighborhood, violation type, and outcome. The data revealed patterns that confirmed community concerns about discriminatory enforcement. The numbers show disproportionate stops of Black and Hispanic drivers, particularly in affluent neighborhoods. We're using this data to identify officers who may need additional training or supervision. Detective Parker, who had been promoted to training supervisor based on her professional handling of Jerome's case, presented results from the new bias reporting system. We've received 47 reports of potential bias incidents since implementation began. 31 were resolved through additional training. 16 required formal counseling or disciplinary action. The reporting system was identifying and addressing problematic behavior before it escalated to discrimination complaints or civil rights violations. Gregory Williams questioned the disciplinary outcomes for Officers Stevens and Morrison. What consequences did they face for the documented policy violations? Captain Fletcher provided a comprehensive report on the disciplinary proceedings. Officer Stevens received a 30-day suspension without pay and mandatory bias counseling. Officer Morrison received a written reprimand and bias training. Both officers remain under probationary supervision. Jerome had mixed feelings about the disciplinary outcomes. The consequences seemed insufficient given the severity of their assumptions and accusations, but he remained focused on systematic prevention rather than individual punishment. Captain, what measures ensure these officers have genuinely changed their approach to community interactions? Both officers are required to complete monthly evaluations with their supervisors and community feedback assessments. Any additional bias incidents will result in termination. Dr. Beverly Carter raised concerns about implementation timelines for community oversight mechanisms. We were promised Citizen Review Board participation in bias incident investigations. When will that begin? Chief Sullivan acknowledged the delay while providing specific timeline commitments. The Citizen Review Board will begin training next month and assume oversight responsibilities for bias incidents within 60 days. The timeline represented progress, though slower than community advocates had hoped. Jerome understood that institutional change required patience while maintaining pressure for accountability. Mayor Jackson provided political context for the reform implementation. These changes have received strong community support and city council approval. We're committed to full funding and implementation. Jerome appreciated the political backing while recognizing that elections could change priorities if community pressure decreased over time. Tiffany Davis presented results from legal community monitoring of police interactions with attorneys. We've documented significant improvements in professional courtesy and respect during traffic stops and courthouse encounters. The improvements suggested that bias training was having measurable effects on officer behavior, at least in interactions with legal professionals. Jerome raised concerns about extending benefits beyond professional communities. The real test of these reforms is whether they improve treatment for all community members, not just attorneys and other professionals. Chief Sullivan presented additional data showing improvements in citizen complaint resolution and community satisfaction scores across all demographic groups. Complaint resolutions have improved by 34%, and citizen satisfaction surveys show increased confidence in professional policing.
Detective Parker provided details about specific cases where bias intervention training had prevented escalation of routine encounters into discrimination incidents. Last week, an officer recognized his own assumptions during a traffic stop involving a young Hispanic male in an expensive vehicle. Instead of escalating based on suspicion, he completed the stop professionally and reported the incident for training review.
The example demonstrated how bias awareness training could change officer behavior in real-time situations rather than simply providing theoretical knowledge. Gregory Williams questioned the sustainability of reforms if media attention and community pressure decreased over time. What mechanisms ensure these changes become permanent rather than temporary responses to public pressure? Chief Sullivan outlined structural changes designed to embed bias prevention into department operations permanently. Bias prevention training is now required for all promotions. Community oversight is written into our operating procedures. Data collection and analysis are mandated by city ordinance. The structural approach suggested genuine commitment to permanent change rather than superficial responses to immediate pressure. Jerome reviewed progress reports from other cities that had implemented similar reforms, noting both successes and challenges in sustaining changes over time. The key factors for long-term success are consistent leadership commitment, community engagement, and data-driven accountability measures. The meeting continued for 3 hours, with detailed discussions of budget allocation, training effectiveness, and community feedback mechanisms. Jerome left the meeting cautiously optimistic about progress, while maintaining realistic expectations about the challenges of sustaining institutional change. The following week brought unexpected validation for the reform efforts. The Department of Justice announced that their police department's bias prevention program would serve as a model for federal guidelines being developed for law enforcement agencies nationwide. Jerome received the news during a client meeting, feeling pride mixed with responsibility about the national implications of their local efforts. Gregory Williams called immediately after the announcement. "Jerome, this validates everything we've worked toward. Your traffic stop experience is now influencing police reform across the country." The federal recognition brought additional resources and technical assistance for implementation while creating pressure for sustained commitment to the reforms. Detective Parker was selected to present their bias prevention training program at the International Association of Chiefs of Police annual conference, highlighting how individual officers could become reform advocates within their departments. Mr. Washington, your willingness to work collaboratively rather than punitively made it possible for officers like me to become allies in reform efforts. Jerome appreciated Parker's recognition while understanding that collaborative approaches required careful balance between accountability and partnership. Officer Hayes, who had visited Jerome's law firm to apologize personally, had become an internal advocate for bias prevention training and was being considered for promotion to training supervisor. "Your conversation with me changed my perspective completely. I want other officers to understand how assumptions can damage community trust." Hayes' transformation demonstrated the potential for individual officers to become reform champions when given opportunities for education and growth rather than simply punishment. The 6-month evaluation showed measurable improvements across all metrics: reduced citizen complaints, increased community satisfaction, better officer morale, and decreased litigation costs for the city. Jerome presented the results to a packed auditorium at the annual Bar Association conference. This case study demonstrates how individual incidents of discrimination can be transformed into catalysts for institutional change through strategic advocacy and community collaboration. His presentation attracted attorneys, civil rights advocates, and police administrators from across the region, spreading awareness about effective reform strategies. The audience included several young black attorneys who approached Jerome afterward to share their own experiences with police bias and express gratitude for his leadership. "Mr. Washington, your example showed us that we don't have to accept discrimination as inevitable. We can demand change and achieve it." Jerome felt particular satisfaction knowing that his experience had empowered other professionals to advocate for themselves and their communities. The reforms had exceeded initial expectations while revealing additional opportunities for improvement and expansion. Community organizations requested similar bias prevention training for other city departments, businesses, and educational institutions. If these approaches work for police interactions, they could improve racial equity across all public services and private sector employment. Jerome agreed to serve as a consultant for expanded bias prevention initiatives, understanding that police reform was just one component of addressing systemic discrimination. The traffic stop that had begun as personal humiliation had evolved into a model for community-driven institutional change with implications extending far beyond law enforcement. 1 year after the incident, Jerome returned to the same street where he'd been stopped, this time accompanied by a documentary film crew producing a program about police reform success stories. The location looked identical, but everything had changed. Police officers in the area had completed comprehensive bias training. Community oversight mechanisms were operational. Data collection provided ongoing accountability for equitable enforcement. Most importantly, young black professionals and community members reported improved interactions with law enforcement and increased confidence in police accountability.
Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is proving them wrong while changing the system that enabled their assumptions. The documentary crew captured his remarks along with interviews from community members, police officials, and reform advocates who had contributed to the changes. Jerome stood beside his Mercedes at the exact spot where Officer Stevens had accused him of driving a stolen vehicle, reflecting on the transformation that had occurred. Detective Parker, now Assistant Chief Parker following her promotion, reflected on the department's transformation. Mr. Washington's case taught us that community trust requires more than good intentions. It requires systematic commitment to fair and professional policing. Officer Hayes, now Training Supervisor Hayes, described how the bias prevention program had changed department culture. We learned that acknowledging our own biases makes us better officers, not weaker ones. Even former Officer Stevens, who had found employment with a security company after leaving the police force, participated in the documentary to acknowledge his mistakes and support reform efforts. I made assumptions that night that were wrong and harmful. I'm grateful that Mr. Washington chose education over punishment and created changes that will prevent other officers from making similar mistakes. Stevens' participation surprised Jerome, who appreciated the former officer's willingness to accept responsibility and support ongoing reform efforts. The documentary's final segment showed Jerome speaking at a national conference about transforming discrimination into institutional change. Individual incidents of bias become catalysts for systematic reform. When communities organize strategically, maintain sustained pressure for accountability, and work collaboratively with institutions willing to change. His presentation received standing ovations from audiences of attorneys, civil rights advocates, police, administrators, and community leaders from across the country. The principles and strategies developed through Jerome's traffic stop experience were being implemented in dozens of cities, creating a movement for police reform that extended far beyond their original community. Jerome's role had evolved from victim of discrimination to national leader in bias prevention and institutional reform. The Bar Association elected him to a second term as president based on his reform leadership and the positive changes achieved through collaborative advocacy. His law firm had become a destination for civil rights attorneys and police reform advocates, building a practice area around bias prevention and institutional change consulting. Most importantly, Jerome's experience had demonstrated that individual encounters with discrimination could be transformed into opportunities for systematic change that benefited entire communities. The traffic stop was over, but its legacy continued expanding as communities across the country adopted similar approaches to police accountability and bias prevention. 18 months after the traffic stop, Jerome stood before a joint session of the state legislature presenting testimony on proposed police reform legislation inspired by their local success. The committee room was packed with legislators, law enforcement officials, civil rights advocates, and community members from across the state. Senate Bill 247 would require all law enforcement agencies to implement bias prevention training, demographic data collection, and community oversight mechanisms similar to those that have proven successful in our city. Jerome's testimony was supported by comprehensive data showing reduced complaints, improved community relations, and decreased litigation costs in jurisdictions that had adopted similar reforms. Committee Chair Senator Elizabeth Morrison questioned the financial implications for smaller police departments with limited budgets. Washington. How do we ensure rural and small-town departments can afford these training requirements without reducing public safety services? Jerome had anticipated cost concerns and prepared detailed responses based on federal grant opportunities and shared resource programs. Senator, the legislation includes provisions for state funding assistance and regional training consortiums that make implementation affordable for departments of any size. His presentation continued for 90 minutes, with questions from legislators representing diverse constituencies and political perspectives. Republican Senator David Hayes raised concerns about federal overreach and local control issues. These requirements seem to impose one-size-fits-all solutions on communities with different needs and challenges. Jerome addressed the federalism concerns while emphasizing the constitutional requirements for equal protection and due process that applied to all communities. Senator Hayes, bias prevention training doesn't impose uniform solutions. It provides tools that local departments can adapt to their specific community needs while meeting constitutional standards. Democratic Senator Lisa Chen focused on accountability mechanisms and enforcement procedures. How do we ensure these requirements are implemented meaningfully rather than just on paper? Jerome outlined the community oversight and data reporting requirements that had proven effective in their city. Accountability requires transparency, community participation, and regular performance measurement. The hearing concluded with bipartisan recognition that police reform was necessary, though disagreement remained about specific implementation approaches and funding mechanisms. Jerome left the Capitol building cautiously optimistic about legislative prospects, while understanding that political processes moved slowly and required sustained advocacy. His afternoon was devoted to a meeting with federal officials from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, who were developing national guidelines for police bias prevention based partly on their local model. Assistant Attorney General Amanda Foster led the federal delegation reviewing successful reform initiatives for potential nationwide implementation. Mr. Washington, your approach to collaborative reform has attracted attention at the highest levels of the Justice Department. We're exploring ways to incentivize similar programs through federal grants and technical assistance. Jerome appreciated federal interest while emphasizing the importance of community-driven change rather than top-down mandates. Ms. Foster, the key to our success was community ownership of the reform process. Federal support is valuable, but local engagement is essential. The federal team included researchers who had studied their city's data extensively, finding measurable improvements across all demographic groups and geographic areas. Citizen complaint resolution improved by 67%. Community trust surveys show significant increases across all racial and ethnic groups. Officer satisfaction and retention rates have also improved. The comprehensive data validated Jerome's strategic approach to reform, while providing evidence for broader implementation.
Evening brought a reception at the law school where Jerome had been invited to deliver the annual civil rights lecture. The audience included law students, faculty, practicing attorneys, and community leaders from across the region. Jerome's presentation focused on practical strategies for transforming individual experiences of discrimination into systematic institutional change. Legal education teaches us to analyze problems and develop solutions, but creating change requires understanding that law is only one tool among many needed for social transformation. The lecture emphasized community organizing, strategic communication, collaborative problem-solving, and sustained advocacy as essential components of effective reform work. During the question period, a first-year law student asked how young attorneys could contribute to reform efforts without Jerome's established position and professional connections. Every attorney has opportunities to advocate for fairness and challenge discriminatory practices. Start with bar association involvement, pro bono work, and community engagement. Build relationships and credibility over time. Jerome's advice reflected his own career path from young associate to community leader, emphasizing that influence developed through consistent professional excellence and community service. A second-year student questioned whether collaborative approaches were appropriate when dealing with clearly discriminatory behavior. Collaboration doesn't mean accepting discrimination or avoiding accountability. It means working strategically to achieve sustainable change rather than just expressing moral outrage. The distinction between strategic and purely emotional responses was central to Jerome's approach throughout the reform process. Following the lecture, Jerome met with law school faculty to discuss curriculum changes that would better prepare future attorneys for civil rights advocacy and institutional reform work. Dean Professor Robert Carter explained their plans for new courses in police accountability, bias prevention, and community organizing. Your case study will be central to our new clinic program where students work on actual reform projects with community organizations and government agencies. The educational initiatives would train future attorneys in the collaborative advocacy skills that had made Jerome's reform efforts successful. Jerome's hotel room that evening was filled with materials for the next day's national conference presentation. The International Association of Police Chiefs had invited him to address their annual meeting about community police collaboration. The invitation represented remarkable progress from the traffic stop encounter to addressing the nation's top police administrators about reform and accountability. Jerome reviewed his presentation materials, focusing on data-driven results rather than emotional appeals or accusatory language. Effective bias prevention serves law enforcement interests by improving community trust, reducing litigation, and enhancing officer safety through better community relationships. His approach emphasized mutual benefits rather than casting reform as punishment for police misconduct. The conference presentation drew an audience of over 800 police chiefs, training supervisors, and community relations specialists from across the country. Jerome began by acknowledging law enforcement's legitimate public safety mission while outlining how bias prevention enhanced rather than undermined effective policing. Community trust is a law enforcement asset. Officers who are trained to recognize and address their own biases are more effective at building relationships that generate intelligence, cooperation, and public support. The law enforcement audience responded positively to practical benefits rather than moral arguments about discrimination. Jerome presented detailed case studies showing how bias training had improved officer decision-making in complex situations, requiring cultural competency and community engagement. Officers report feeling more confident in diverse community interactions after completing bias awareness training. They have better tools for de-escalation and problem-solving. Assistant Chief Parker, who had accompanied Jerome to the conference, presented the law enforcement perspective on implementing bias prevention programs. These reforms made me a better officer and supervisor. Understanding my own assumptions helped me make more professional decisions and mentor other officers more effectively. Her presentation carried credibility within the law enforcement community that Jerome's advocacy alone couldn't provide. The question period revealed both support and skepticism from police administrators facing budget constraints and political pressures. How do you address officers who resist bias training as political correctness or reverse discrimination? Asked a chief from a mid-sized city. Jerome had encountered similar resistance and developed strategies for addressing it constructively. Frame training as professional development rather than political correctness. Focus on practical skills and officer safety benefits rather than social justice themes.
Another chief questioned whether bias prevention programs actually reduced discriminatory behavior or simply made discrimination more subtle and harder to document. That's why data collection and community oversight are essential components. Measuring outcomes rather than just training completion ensures actual behavior change. Jerome's systematic approach impressed even skeptical administrators by providing accountability measures and performance metrics. The conference concluded with commitments from dozens of police departments to explore implementing similar bias prevention programs in their communities. Jerome's transformation from traffic stop victim to national police reform advocate was complete, but his work was expanding rather than concluding. The following months brought speaking invitations from universities, civil rights organizations, bar associations, and government agencies across the country. Each presentation provided opportunities to share lessons learned while adapting strategies to different community contexts and challenges. Jerome's consulting practice had grown to include work with police departments, civil rights organizations, and government agencies seeking to implement effective bias prevention programs. The financial success allowed him to dedicate more time to pro bono work and community advocacy while maintaining his law firm partnership. Most importantly, Jerome had developed a replicable model for transforming individual incidents of discrimination into catalysts for institutional change.
Communities across the country were adapting his strategies to address bias in education, healthcare, employment, and other areas beyond law enforcement. The traffic stop that had lasted less than an hour had generated a movement for systemic change, with implications extending far beyond its original circumstances. Jerome's experience demonstrated how individual resilience, strategic thinking, and community collaboration could transform injustice into opportunities for progress. His story continued inspiring other professionals who faced discrimination to seek systematic solutions rather than simply accepting unfair treatment as inevitable. The reforms were spreading, the impact was growing, and the movement for bias prevention and institutional accountability was becoming self-sustaining across multiple communities and institutions. 2 years after the traffic stop, Jerome walked through the police department's new Community Engagement Center, a facility that had been established as part of the reforms to improve police-community relations. The space buzzed with activity as officers, community members, and advocacy groups worked together on collaborative problem-solving initiatives. Training Supervisor Hayes greeted Jerome at the entrance, his transformation from the uncertain officer at the traffic stop to a reform leader now complete. Mr. Washington, welcome to our monthly community forum. We have representatives from 12 neighborhood organizations participating today. The forum represented institutionalized community input into police policies and practices, ensuring that reforms remained responsive to community needs rather than becoming bureaucratic requirements. Jerome observed discussions about traffic enforcement priorities, community policing strategies, and bias prevention training updates. The conversations were respectful and productive, demonstrating trust that had been built through consistent transparency and accountability. Assistant Chief Parker facilitated a workshop on recognizing and addressing implicit bias, with participation from both officers and community members. Her presentation had evolved significantly since Jerome's initial encounter with her professionalism. Bias awareness isn't about guilt or blame, Parker explained to the mixed audience. It's about developing skills that make us more effective in our work and more fair in our interactions with all community members. The workshop included role-playing exercises where officers and citizens practiced de-escalation techniques and respectful communication strategies. Jerome participated in one exercise, playing the role of a motorist being stopped for a traffic violation. The experience was surreal given his history, but demonstrated how far relationships had progressed. The officer in the exercise, a young recruit named Officer Jessica Martinez, handled the simulated stop with professionalism and respect that contrasted sharply with Stevens and Morrison's approach 2 years earlier. "Sir, I stopped you for exceeding the speed limit. May I see your license and registration, please?" Martinez's tone was courteous and professional, her body language non-threatening. Jerome provided the requested documents while maintaining the demeanor of a cooperative citizen. The interaction concluded with a warning rather than a citation and respectful acknowledgement from both parties. Following the exercise, Jerome provided feedback to Martinez about her professional approach while sharing insights from his own experience as both an attorney and a community member who had faced police bias. "Officer Martinez, your respectful communication style creates positive interactions that build community trust while maintaining your authority and safety." Martinez appreciated the feedback while asking thoughtful questions about community perspectives on police interactions. "Mr. Washington, how can officers like me continue improving our approach to serve all community members fairly?" Jerome's response emphasized ongoing education, community engagement, and willingness to acknowledge and learn from mistakes. "Officer Martinez, the fact that you're asking that question demonstrates the professional attitude that makes effective policing possible. The afternoon included a presentation from Dr. Beverly Carter about measurable improvements in police-community relations since the reforms had been implemented. Citizen complaints have decreased by 73%. Community satisfaction with police services has increased across all demographic groups. Officer retention and job satisfaction have also improved significantly. The comprehensive data demonstrated that bias prevention and community accountability served everyone's interests rather than creating zero-sum conflicts between police and community priorities. Jerome presented updates on similar reform efforts in other cities that had adopted their model, sharing lessons learned about implementation challenges and successful strategies. 37 cities have now implemented similar bias prevention programs. The results consistently show improved community relations and more effective policing. The national impact of their local reforms had exceeded Jerome's initial expectations while validating the strategic approach they had developed. Mayor Jackson provided political context for sustaining the reforms through changing administrations and budget pressures. These programs have bipartisan support because they produce measurable results that benefit everyone. Community safety improves when police and residents work together effectively. The political sustainability was crucial for ensuring long-term success rather than temporary changes that might be reversed when public attention decreased. Evening brought Jerome to the annual awards dinner for the state's civil rights organization, where he was receiving recognition for his leadership in police reform advocacy.
Dr. Beverly Carter introduced Jerome to an audience of over 400 community leaders, civil rights advocates, and public officials. Jerome Washington demonstrated how individual experiences of discrimination can be transformed into catalysts for institutional change that benefits entire communities. Jerome's acceptance remarks focused on collective achievement rather than personal recognition. This award belongs to everyone who contributed to police reform: community activists who maintained pressure for accountability, officers who embraced change and became reform advocates, and political leaders who supported necessary investments in bias prevention.
His speech emphasized that sustainable change required collaboration among diverse stakeholders rather than adversarial approaches that created winners and losers. The audience included many people whose lives had been affected by the reforms, from young professionals who reported improved police interactions to officers who had gained skills and confidence through bias prevention training. Jerome's remarks concluded with challenges for continued progress. We've demonstrated that discrimination can be addressed through strategic advocacy and collaborative problem-solving. Now we must apply these approaches to other institutions and systems that affect community well-being. The evening's networking provided opportunities to discuss expanding bias prevention initiatives to education, healthcare, employment, and other areas where discrimination remained problematic. Judge Kenneth Johnson approached Jerome during the reception to discuss judicial education about implicit bias and its effects on courtroom interactions and sentencing decisions. Jerome, your police reform model could be adapted for judicial training. We need similar awareness about how assumptions affect legal proceedings. The conversation highlighted opportunities for applying bias prevention principles across multiple branches of government and civil society institutions. Congresswoman Linda Foster discussed federal legislation that would incentivize bias prevention training through grant programs and regulatory requirements. Your local success provides a template for national policy that could benefit communities across the country. Jerome appreciated federal interest while emphasizing the importance of local adaptation and community ownership of reform processes. The following week brought Jerome to the university where he had been appointed as a visiting professor teaching a course on civil rights advocacy and institutional reform. His classroom included law students, social work students, public administration students, and community activists seeking practical skills for creating social change. Effective advocacy requires understanding that institutions can change when reform serves their interests as well as community needs, Jerome explained to his diverse class. The curriculum combined theoretical knowledge with practical experience through internships with community organizations, government agencies, and legal advocacy groups. Students worked on actual reform projects, applying strategic thinking and collaborative approaches to current civil rights challenges. One student team was developing bias prevention training for healthcare providers to address racial disparities in medical treatment and patient outcomes. Another team focused on educational equity, examining how implicit bias affected disciplinary policies and academic opportunities for students of color. A third team investigated employment discrimination, developing strategies for addressing bias in hiring, promotion, and workplace culture. Jerome supervised their projects while providing guidance based on his experience transforming individual discrimination into systematic change. The semester's final presentations demonstrated students' grasp of strategic advocacy principles and their ability to develop practical solutions for complex social problems. You've learned that creating change requires patience, persistence, and strategic thinking rather than just moral outrage, Jerome told his students during the final class. Your generation will face new forms of discrimination and injustice. The principles we've studied provide tools for addressing those challenges systematically rather than simply reacting emotionally. The teaching experience energized Jerome while providing opportunities to train future leaders in effective civil rights advocacy. His impact was multiplying through students who would carry reform principles into their own professional careers and community involvement. The summer brought an unexpected opportunity. Jerome was selected as one of 12 Americans to participate in an international conference on police reform and community relations hosted by the United Nations. The conference brought together reform advocates, government officials, and law enforcement leaders from 30 countries to share strategies for addressing police bias and building community trust. Jerome's presentation focused on collaborative approaches that addressed institutional interests while achieving community goals. Sustainable reform requires understanding that police departments, like all institutions, respond to incentives. Effective advocacy creates incentives for change rather than simply demanding it. International participants shared their own reform experiences, providing Jerome with new perspectives on bias prevention and community engagement. Representatives from the United Kingdom described their approach to community policing that emphasized problem-solving partnerships between police and residents. Canadian officials presented data on bias prevention training programs that had reduced racial disparities in traffic stops and arrests. South African advocates discussed post-apartheid police reforms that transformed discriminatory law enforcement into community-responsive public safety services. The international exchange provided validation for Jerome's collaborative approach while offering new strategies for addressing bias and building accountability. Jerome's final presentation at the UN conference outlined principles for transforming individual incidents into systematic change. First, document discrimination thoroughly and professionally. Second, build coalitions that include diverse stakeholders. Third, propose solutions that serve institutional interests while achieving reform goals. Fourth, maintain sustained pressure for accountability and implementation. Fifth, measure outcomes to ensure real change rather than cosmetic adjustments. The 5-point framework was adopted by several international reform initiatives, extending Jerome's influence to global police accountability efforts. Return flights to the United States provided time for reflection on the journey from traffic stop victim to international reform advocate. The transformation had been remarkable, but also demonstrated how individual resilience and strategic thinking could create opportunities for progress, even from experiences of discrimination and injustice.
Jerome's phone contained messages from community members, reform advocates, and government officials seeking his input on new initiatives and emerging challenges. The work was expanding rather than concluding, with new opportunities to apply bias prevention principles to additional institutions and systems. Most importantly, the reforms had become self-sustaining rather than dependent on Jerome's individual advocacy. Community oversight mechanisms were operational, Officer training programs were institutionalized. Data collection provided ongoing accountability. Political support existed across party lines. The traffic stop that had lasted less than an hour had generated changes that would continue benefiting community members for years to come. Jerome's experience proved that individual encounters with discrimination, when approached strategically, could become catalysts for institutional transformation with implications extending far beyond their original circumstances. 5 years after the traffic stop, Jerome stood in the Rose Garden of the White House as President Richardson signed the National Police Accountability Act into law. The legislation, which had grown from Jerome's local reform efforts, would require bias prevention training, demographic data collection, and community oversight for all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding. This law represents the transformation of individual experience into national policy, President Richardson said during the signing ceremony. When citizens like Jerome Washington face discrimination with dignity and strategic advocacy, entire systems can change for the better. Jerome felt profound satisfaction watching federal legislation that traced directly to his traffic stop encounter create accountability mechanisms for police departments across the country. The ceremony brought together reform advocates, law enforcement leaders, and community representatives who had contributed to the legislation's development and passage. Assistant Chief Parker, now Chief Parker, following her promotion to lead their city's police department, represented law enforcement support for the national reforms. Mr. Washington's case taught us that accountability serves police interests by improving community trust, reducing litigation, and enhancing public safety through better police-community relationships. Chief Parker's journey from the professional detective who had verified Jerome's identity to a national advocate for police reform demonstrated how individual officers could become institutional change agents. Gregory Williams, now serving as Deputy Director of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, had helped draft the federal legislation based on their local model. This law provides incentives for proactive reform rather than reactive punishment. Police departments that implement comprehensive bias prevention receive additional funding and technical assistance. The incentive-based approach reflected Jerome's strategic preference for collaboration over confrontation in achieving institutional change. Following the White House ceremony, Jerome participated in a panel discussion at the National Press Club about transforming individual experiences of discrimination into catalysts for systematic reform. The key insight from my traffic stop experience was understanding that personal vindication is less valuable than institutional change, Jerome explained to the assembled journalists and policy experts. Individual lawsuits might provide monetary compensation, but they don't prevent similar incidents. Systematic reform addresses root causes rather than just symptoms. The panel included other reform advocates who had transformed personal experiences with discrimination into broader social change initiatives. Dr. Maria Gonzalez described how her experience with medical bias had led to healthcare reform legislation requiring cultural competency training for all medical professionals. Professor David Kim outlined education reforms that grew from his encounter with academic discrimination, creating accountability measures for bias in hiring and promotion decisions. Attorney Lisa Rodriguez explained how workplace discrimination she faced had generated employment law changes requiring bias prevention training for all supervisory personnel. The diverse examples demonstrated that Jerome's strategic approach could be applied across multiple institutions and systems rather than just law enforcement. Jerome's presentation emphasized replicable principles rather than unique circumstances, document discrimination professionally, build diverse coalitions, propose solutions that serve institutional interests, maintain pressure for accountability, measure outcomes to ensure real change. The framework had been applied successfully in dozens of communities and institutions, creating a movement for bias prevention that extended far beyond its origins in police reform. Questions from journalists focused on challenges in sustaining reform efforts over time and across changing political administrations. How do you prevent reforms from being reversed when public attention decreases or political priorities change? Asked a reporter from the Washington Post. Jerome's response emphasized structural embedding rather than temporary policy adjustments. Effective reforms become part of institutional DNA through training requirements, data systems, budget allocations, and performance measures that survive personnel and political changes. Their local reforms had indeed survived 2 mayoral elections, multiple police chief transitions, and varying levels of community attention, while continuing to produce measurable improvements in police-community relations. The afternoon brought Jerome to Capitol Hill for meetings with congressional representatives about expanding bias prevention requirements to additional federal agencies and contractor organizations. Senator Elizabeth Morrison, who had supported the police accountability legislation, was now proposing similar requirements for federal immigration enforcement, TSA airport security, and other agencies with significant public interaction. Mr. Washington, your police reform model provides a template for addressing bias across all federal law enforcement and security operations. Jerome appreciated the legislative interest while emphasizing the importance of agency-specific adaptation rather than one-size-fits-all implementation. Senator Morrison, each agency has unique operational requirements and community impacts. Bias prevention principles remain constant, but implementation strategies must be tailored to specific contexts. Congressional meetings continued throughout the afternoon, with representatives from both parties expressing interest in expanding bias prevention initiatives to their priority areas. Republican Congressman James Fletcher focused on economic development applications, suggesting that bias prevention in business licensing and regulatory enforcement could improve small business success rates in underserved communities. Democratic Congresswoman Amanda Foster emphasized education applications, proposing bias prevention training for teachers and administrators to address racial disparities in discipline and academic achievement. The bipartisan interest reflected Jerome's success in framing bias prevention as serving everyone's interests rather than creating zero-sum conflicts between different groups. Evening brought Jerome to a Georgetown University symposium on civil rights advocacy in the digital age, where his case study was being analyzed by academic researchers and policy experts. Professor Robert Sterling, who had studied their reforms extensively, presented data showing measurable improvements in police accountability across all jurisdictions that had implemented similar programs. The Washington model has been adopted by 247 police departments nationwide, serving communities with over 45 million residents. Citizen complaints have decreased by an average of 54%. Community trust surveys show significant improvements across all demographic groups. The comprehensive data validated Jerome's strategic approach while providing evidence for expanded implementation. Dr. Beverly Carter, now directing the National Institute for Police Accountability, presented research on the economic benefits of bias prevention programs. Communities that implement comprehensive police reforms experience reduced litigation costs, improved business development, and increased property values. The return on investment averages 340% over 5 years. The economic argument strengthened political support for reform initiatives while demonstrating that bias prevention served fiscal as well as social interests. Jerome's presentation at the symposium focused on lessons learned from 5 years of reform implementation and expansion. The most important insight has been understanding that sustainable change requires transforming individual experiences into institutional learning rather than seeking personal vindication or punishment. He outlined evolution in righted Livio, in his own thinking from the immediate aftermath of the traffic stop through national policy development. Initially, I was angry and wanted those officers held accountable for their assumptions and accusations, but anger without strategy produces temporary satisfaction rather than lasting change. Jerome described how collaborative approaches had achieved more comprehensive reforms than adversarial strategies would have accomplished. Working with police administrators, community leaders, and political officials created ownership of solutions rather than resistance to imposed requirements. The audience included law students, civil rights advocates, policy researchers, and government officials who asked detailed questions about replicating reform strategies in their own communities and institutions. How do you maintain collaborative relationships while holding institutions accountable for meaningful change? Asked a graduate student studying public administration. Jerome's response emphasized the importance of measuring outcomes rather than relying on good intentions. Collaboration doesn't mean accepting promises without verification. Data collection and community oversight ensure that collaborative approaches produce real results. Another question focused on addressing resistance from institutional leaders who preferred status quo operations over reform requirements. What strategies work with administrators who view bias prevention as unnecessary political correctness or burdensome regulation? Jerome had encountered such resistance repeatedly and developed approaches for addressing it constructively. Frame reforms as professional development and operational improvement rather than moral correction. Emphasize practical benefits like reduced liability, improved employee satisfaction, and enhanced community relations. The symposium concluded with commitment from several universities to establish research centers focusing on bias prevention and institutional reform strategies. Jerome's influence was expanding through academic research and policy development that would train future leaders in effective civil rights advocacy. The following morning brought Jerome to the Department of Justice for meetings about international technical assistance programs that would export American bias prevention expertise to police forces in other countries. Assistant Attorney General Gregory Williams outlined requests from European, African, and Latin American governments seeking help with police reform initiatives. Your model provides a framework that can be adapted to different legal systems and cultural contexts while maintaining core principles of accountability and bias prevention. Jerome appreciated international interest while emphasizing the importance of local adaptation and cultural sensitivity. Police reform strategies must reflect community values and institutional structures rather than imposing American solutions on different contexts. The international programs would provide opportunities to test bias prevention principles across diverse settings while learning from other countries' approaches to police accountability. Jerome's final Washington meeting was with the White House Domestic Policy Council about expanding bias prevention requirements to additional federal programs and contractor organizations. Policy Director Amanda Foster outlined proposals for including bias prevention training in federal education grants, healthcare programs, and economic development initiatives. Your police reform success demonstrates that bias prevention can be integrated into existing programs without creating new bureaucratic burdens or excessive costs. Jerome supported expanded implementation while emphasizing the importance of adequate funding and technical assistance for successful program development. Effective bias prevention requires investment in training, data systems, and community engagement, rather than simply adding requirements to existing responsibilities. The White House meetings concluded with commitments to include bias prevention components in major federal domestic policy initiatives over the coming year. Jerome's flight home provided time to reflect on the remarkable journey from traffic stop victim to national policy advisor. The transformation had required strategic thinking, collaborative relationships, sustained advocacy, and willingness to focus on institutional change rather than personal vindication. Most importantly, the reforms had become self-sustaining and expanding rather than dependent on Jerome's individual involvement. Police departments across the country were implementing bias prevention programs. Federal legislation provided ongoing accountability and funding. Academic institutions were training future leaders in reform strategies. The traffic stop that had lasted less than an hour had generated changes affecting millions of Americans and inspiring reform efforts in other countries. Jerome's experience demonstrated how individual resilience and strategic advocacy could transform injustice into opportunities for progress that extended far beyond personal circumstances. The work was far from complete, but momentum for bias prevention and institutional accountability had become a permanent feature of American civil rights advocacy. 10 years after the traffic stop, Jerome sat in his home office reviewing the final draft of his book, From Traffic Stop to Transformation, a strategic guide to civil rights advocacy. The manuscript represented a decade of lessons learned about converting individual experiences of discrimination into catalysts for institutional change. Outside his window, the same tree-lined street where he'd been pulled over had become a symbol of transformation. The city had installed a historical marker commemorating the incident that sparked nationwide police reform, though Jerome had mixed feelings about the recognition. Denise entered with coffee and the morning newspaper, which featured a front-page story about the 10th anniversary of the National Police Accountability Act. The article included statistics showing continued improvements in police-community relations across the country. "The data keeps getting better," Denise observed, scanning the article's charts and graphs. "Citizen complaints down 68% nationally. Community trust surveys at historic highs. Officer retention and satisfaction improved in every major city." Felt satisfaction reading the numbers, while recognizing that data represented real changes in real people's lives. Thousands of traffic stops now concluded professionally rather than escalating into discrimination incidents. His phone buzzed with a text from Chief Parker, now serving as police chief in a major metropolitan department that had recruited her specifically to implement bias prevention programs. "Jerome, our 10th anniversary community celebration is next month. The whole department wants to thank you for showing us how to do this work better." The message reflected how completely police culture had shifted in departments that embraced reform rather than resisting it. Jerome's morning routine included reviewing emails from reform advocates, government officials, and community members worldwide who had implemented similar bias prevention initiatives in their own contexts. A message from Dr. Maria Gonzalez in Mexico City described police reforms inspired by Jerome's model that had improved law enforcement interactions with indigenous communities. Another email from Professor David Kim in Seoul outlined bias prevention training for Korean police that addressed discrimination against foreign workers and ethnic minorities. A third message came from attorney Lisa Rodriguez in Sao Paulo, who had adapted Jerome's collaborative approach to address police violence in Brazilian favelas through community engagement and officer training. The international impact demonstrated how strategic advocacy principles could transcend cultural and legal differences while addressing universal human rights concerns. Jerome's calendar showed a packed schedule of speaking engagements, consulting meetings, and community events related to his continuing civil rights work. At 10 a.m., he would address law school graduates about careers in civil rights advocacy. At 2 p.m., a consulting call with police administrators in Denver, seeking to enhance their bias prevention programs. At 4 p.m., a community meeting about expanding bias prevention training to school districts and healthcare systems. The work had evolved from reactive responses to discrimination into proactive institution building that prevented bias before it caused harm. Jerome's law firm had grown into a national practice specializing in institutional reform and bias prevention, with offices in 12 cities and clients ranging from police departments to corporations to government agencies. His partners included former students from his university teaching, civil rights attorneys who shared his collaborative approach, and reform advocates who had successfully implemented bias prevention in their own communities. The firm's success reflected growing demand for strategic civil rights expertise that achieved measurable change rather than simply filing lawsuits or staging protests. Jerome drove to the law school through streets where he now noticed different interactions between police and community members. Officers approached situations with visible awareness of bias issues. Community members showed greater confidence in police accountability mechanisms. The changes weren't universal or complete, but they were real and expanding as more officers received training and more communities implemented oversight systems. At the law school, Dean Professor Robert Carter introduced Jerome to an auditorium filled with graduating students who would soon begin careers throughout the legal profession. Jerome Washington represents the power of strategic thinking to transform individual injustice into systematic change that benefits entire communities. Jerome's address focused on practical career advice rather than inspirational rhetoric, emphasizing that effective civil rights advocacy required professional excellence and community engagement over time. Your legal education provides analytical tools for understanding problems and developing solutions. But creating change requires building relationships, understanding institutional incentives, and maintaining sustained pressure for accountability. During the question period, students asked about balancing idealism with pragmatic compromise, addressing resistance from institutional leaders, and maintaining motivation during lengthy reform processes. How do you work collaboratively with people who have discriminated against you or your community? Asked a third-year student planning to practice employment discrimination law. Jerome's response drew from his experience with officers Stevens and Morrison, both of whom had eventually participated in training programs and community reconciliation processes. Collaboration doesn't mean forgetting or excusing discrimination. It means focusing on preventing future harm rather than punishing past mistakes. Sometimes former opponents become effective advocates for change. Another student questioned whether collaborative approaches were sufficient for addressing systematic racism and institutional discrimination. Strategic collaboration isn't passive acceptance of injustice. It's tactical choice about how to achieve maximum impact with available resources and opportunities. Jerome's presentation concluded with specific career advice about building expertise, developing professional networks, and identifying opportunities for institutional engagement. Civil rights careers develop through consistent professional excellence combined with community service. Build credibility through competent legal work, then use that credibility to advocate for justice. The afternoon consulting call with Denver police administrators provided insight into how reform implementation had evolved over the decade. Captain Jennifer Foster described their department's comprehensive bias prevention program, which included monthly training sessions, quarterly community forums, and annual independent assessments of progress. Mr. Washington, we've eliminated racial disparities in traffic stops and arrests while improving officer satisfaction and community trust. The collaborative approach you modeled made sustainable change possible. The Denver program had adapted Jerome's principles to local conditions while maintaining core elements of training, accountability, and community engagement. Detective Supervisor Manuel Rodriguez provided operational details about how bias awareness had become integrated into daily police work rather than remaining separate training requirements. Officers now routinely discuss potential bias issues during briefings and case reviews. It's become part of professional culture rather than imposed compliance. The cultural transformation represented the most significant achievement of reform efforts, creating self-sustaining change rather than dependence on external oversight. Jerome's final question addressed sustainability challenges as reform advocates retired or moved to different positions. What mechanisms ensure these programs continue even if leadership changes or community attention decreases? Captain Foster outlined structural embeddings that had made bias prevention integral to department operations, budget line items for training, promotion requirements that included bias awareness, data systems that tracked outcomes, and community oversight boards with independent authority. These reforms have become institutional DNA rather than temporary policy adjustments. The evening community meeting attracted over 200 residents interested in expanding bias prevention beyond police interactions to schools, healthcare, employment, and housing. Dr. Beverly Carter, now directing a national foundation focused on bias prevention research, presented evidence about discrimination in multiple institutional contexts. Healthcare providers show measurable bias in pain, assessment, and treatment recommendations. Teachers demonstrate bias in disciplinary decisions and academic expectations. Employers exhibit bias in hiring and promotion processes. The comprehensive data demonstrated that bias prevention principles could address discrimination across all community institutions rather than just law enforcement. Jerome facilitated discussions about implementation strategies that adapted police reform lessons to different institutional contexts. The same principles apply everywhere: professional training to recognize bias, data collection to measure outcomes, accountability mechanisms to ensure change, and community involvement to maintain pressure for improvement. Community members asked detailed questions about timelines, funding requirements, and political strategies for achieving institutional cooperation. How do you convince school administrators or hospital executives to invest in bias prevention training? Asked a parent concerned about educational equity. Jerome's response emphasized demonstrating benefits rather than simply demanding compliance. Show institutions how bias prevention serves their interests by improving outcomes, reducing complaints, and enhancing community relationships. The meeting concluded with formation of working groups focused on different institutional areas, each committed to developing specific reform proposals over the coming months. Jerome drove home through neighborhoods where community members now participated actively in police accountability processes. Schools had implemented bias prevention training for teachers and administrators, and healthcare systems had begun addressing racial disparities in treatment outcomes. The changes represented organic expansion of bias prevention principles rather than top-down mandates, creating sustainable transformation that reflected community ownership of solutions. At home, Denise had prepared dinner and gathered materials related to Jerome's upcoming testimony before a United Nations committee developing international standards for police accountability and bias prevention. The UN wants your reform model to become part of global human rights standards, she said, reviewing invitation letters from diplomatic representatives of 15 countries. Jerome felt honored by the international recognition while remaining focused on local implementation challenges that required continued attention. Global standards are valuable, but real change happens in individual communities when people decide to transform discrimination into opportunities for institutional improvement. His reflection captured the essence of lessons learned over 10 years of reform, advocacy. Systematic change required strategic thinking, collaborative relationships, sustained pressure, and focus on measurable outcomes rather than moral satisfaction. The traffic stop that had lasted less than an hour had generated a decade of institutional transformation, affecting millions of people across multiple countries and institutional contexts. Jerome's experience proved that individual encounters with injustice, when approached strategically rather than emotionally, could become catalysts for systematic change, with implications extending far beyond their original circumstances. The book manuscript on his desk would soon provide other advocates with practical tools for converting their own experiences of discrimination into opportunities for institutional reform and community progress. Most importantly, the reforms had become self-sustaining and expanding. No longer dependent on Jerome's individual advocacy, but embedded in institutional cultures and community expectations across multiple sectors. Young professionals who had never experienced the discrimination Jerome faced a decade earlier were building careers in environments where bias prevention was standard practice rather than exceptional accommodation. The transformation was incomplete and ongoing, but momentum for bias prevention and institutional accountability had become a permanent feature of American civil rights advocacy, with influence extending internationally. Jerome's legacy lay not in personal vindication but in systematic change that would continue benefiting future generations long after his individual story was forgotten. The traffic stop was over, but the movement it had generated would continue expanding as new advocates applied strategic thinking to convert their own encounters with injustice into catalysts for lasting institutional change. That evening, as Jerome finished reviewing his book manuscript, he reflected on a simple truth that had guided his entire approach. Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is proving them wrong while changing the system that enabled their assumptions. The work continued, the impact expanded, and the possibility for transformation remained available to anyone willing to think strategically about converting individual experiences into collective progress. These stories remind us that encounters with discrimination, while painful and unjust, can become opportunities for systematic change when approached with strategic thinking, collaborative engagement, and sustained commitment to institutional transformation. Your own experiences with bias or discrimination matter. They represent opportunities to create change that extends beyond personal circumstances to benefit entire communities. Share your story in the comments below. Tell us about times when you faced assumptions or discrimination based on your race, profession, or success. Subscribe for more stories about people who transform challenges into catalysts for positive change. Share this video with someone who needs to see that dignity, intelligence, and strategic thinking can overcome prejudice while creating lasting institutional reform. Together, we can build communities where everyone receives the respect and fair treatment they deserve, regardless of their race, background, or circumstances.